Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was a little after midnight when I got to the gym. I had a long day at work and I wanted to blow off some steam. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. There was one guy on a treadmill when I arrived, but he left after about 20 minutes. By then, it was just me. I liked the quiet. I didn't have to wait for machines, and I didn't have to deal with anyone taking up space by scrolling on their phone. The gym wasn't huge, just a single floor with a weight section in one corner and cardio machines in another. The locker rooms were in the back, and there was a staff desk near the entrance. I did my usual routine, some bench presses, a bit of time on the rowing machine, and a lot of focus on the free weights. I lost track of time, like I always do. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when I decided to wrap up. My arms were sore, and I figured I'd done enough for the night. When I grabbed my water bottle and towel, I noticed the place was eerily quiet. More than usual. I hadn't seen the staff member in a while, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they'd step out for a smoke or to grab something from the back office. I walked to the front door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. It was one of those heavy glass doors with a magnetic lock that needed a key card to open. I assumed my key card just hadn't scanned properly, so I swiped it again. The reader beeped, but the door stayed shut. I tried a few more times, each swipe followed by the same beep, but the lock didn't release. I looked around for the staff member, but the desk was empty. I knocked on the door in case they were outside. No one came. My phone was in my gym bag, so I pulled it out to call the number posted near the desk. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the system was down, and the staff had stepped out. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd wait a bit and they'd come back. I sat on one of the benches near the free weights and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, almost like I imagined it. A heavy breath, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere near the back of the gym. I froze, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the air conditioning. Then it came again. Louder this time. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark corner near the locker rooms. The lights in that area were dimmer than the rest of the gym, but I could just make out the shapes of the lockers and the doorway leading to the bathrooms. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. I told myself it was probably just the air vents or something falling over in the locker room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I took a few steps toward the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Is someone there? I asked. This time, I heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty gym, coming from the direction of the locker rooms. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, looking for something to defend myself with. The best I could find was one of the metal dumbbells. I grabbed it, the cold weight steadying my shaking hands. Who's there? I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a staff member playing a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in and was messing with me. Or maybe it was something worse. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark corner. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low and quiet, almost a chuckle. It didn't sound right. There was no humor in it, just something wrong. I backed away, keeping the dumbbell raised in front of me. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cracking. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, and I told the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since I was in a more remote area of the city. I kept the operator on the line as I moved toward the front of the gym. I could still see the dark corner out of the corner of my eye, but whoever was there hadn't moved again. The operator told me to stay on the line and try to find a safe place to wait. The staff desk had a small storage cabinet underneath. I crouched down and wedged myself inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering updates to the operator. Then the footsteps started again. Slow and steady, moving closer to the front of the gym. I clutched the dumbbell tighter, my breath shallow and fast. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the sound of those steps. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look down and see me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They headed toward the glass doors. I peeked out from the cabinet, just enough to see a figure standing there. The light from the street lamps outside cast their shadow across the floor. They stood there for a moment, their back to me. Then they turned their heads slightly, like they were listening for something. I ducked back into the cabinet, squeezing my eyes shut. A loud bang echoed through the gym. I jumped, hitting my head on the top of the cabinet. It was the front door. The figure was slamming their shoulder against it, trying to break it open. I told the operator what was happening, my voice barely more than a whisper. They assured me the police were on their way. The banging stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the weight section. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. The figure froze, then bolted toward the back of the gym. I stayed in the cabinet until I heard the sound of voices calling out, telling me it was safe to come out. The police found no one in the gym. Whoever it was must have slipped out through an emergency exit before they arrived. They checked the security footage, but the cameras in the back corner had been tampered with. I haven't been back to that gym since. I canceled my membership the next day. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel that same icy fear, like they're still there, just waiting. I was on the subway heading home late one evening after staying longer at work than I planned. It was one of those trains with the fluorescent lights that always seem too bright, making the gray metal of the car feel colder somehow. The ride wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered along the seats. Most of them were staring at their phones, heads down, not paying attention to anything around them. I sat near the doors, clutching my bag on my lap, counting the stops until mine. About 3 stops in, I noticed him. A man sitting across the aisle, 1 row down. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was dressed pretty plainly, dark jacket, jeans, nothing unusual. But something about the way he sat caught my eye. He wasn't looking at a phone or out the window like everyone else. He was staring directly at me. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe he wasn't staring. Maybe he was just looking in my direction. But every time I glanced up, his eyes were on me. He didn't even pretend to look away when I caught him. Just kept staring. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was zoning out or tired. I put my headphones in and stared at my phone, trying to focus on the music. It didn't help. I could still feel his eyes on me. By the time we were 2 stops away from mine, I decided to move. I stood up and walked toward the other end of the car, taking a seat closer to the doors. I didn't look back to see if he noticed, but I could feel it. That heavy, prickling sensation that someone's watching you. When the train pulled into my stop, I stood up quickly, slipping out the doors as soon as they opened. The station was almost empty, just a few people heading toward the exits. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The man had gotten off too. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't hanging back either. Just walking at a steady pace, his hands in his jacket pockets. His eyes didn't leave me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby or was heading to the same area. But as I walked toward the stairs leading to the street, he followed. Same pace. Same distance. I reached the top of the stairs and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The street was quieter than I hoped. A couple of cars passed, but no one else was walking nearby. I turned left, heading toward my apartment, and quickened my pace. The sound of his footsteps matched mine, just a few paces behind. Panic started to creep in. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the strap of my bag. I didn't want to look back again, didn't want to confirm what I already knew. But I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, closer now. I turned down another street, hoping to lose him, but he turned too. My building wasn't far, but there was no way I was leading him to where I lived. I reached for my phone and pretended to make a call, hoping it would deter him. "Hey, I'm almost there," I said loudly, trying to sound calm. "Can you meet me outside?" There was no response from behind me. Just the steady sound of footsteps. I decided to test something. At the next corner, I crossed the street abruptly without looking back. The second I stepped onto the other side, I glanced behind me. He was crossing too. I knew then it wasn't a coincidence. I ducked into the nearest store I could find, a small convenience store with bright lights and a clerk behind the counter. I stayed by the shelves near the window, pretending to look at something, but really watching the street. The man walked past the store slowly, his head turning slightly toward the glass. His pace didn't change, but he didn't keep walking far. He stopped a few feet down and leaned against a lamppost, his back to me. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I debated asking the clerk for help, but I didn't know what to say. A man's following me? What if he came in while I was explaining? What if he didn't leave at all? I waited a few minutes, hoping he would go away. He didn't. He just stayed there, standing in the same spot, like he was waiting for me to come out. I couldn't stay in the store all night. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but I needed a plan. I pulled out my phone and called a friend who lived nearby. I didn't explain everything, just said I needed them to meet me at the corner near my building. They agreed, sensing the urgency in my voice. When I hung up, I took a deep breath and walked out of the store. The man was still there. He straightened up when he saw me, falling into step a few paces behind as I started walking again. I didn't go straight to my apartment. Instead, I headed toward the spot where I was meeting my friend. I kept my pace steady, trying not to let the fear show, even though my legs felt like they might give out. When I reached the corner, I saw my friend standing there. Relief washed over me like a wave. I hurried toward them, and when they saw me, They waved, calling out my name loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. The man stopped a few feet away. He stood there for a moment, like he was deciding what to do. Then he turned and walked back the way we'd come. I didn't go straight home that night. My friend stayed with me until I felt safe again, but the fear didn't leave. For weeks after, I kept looking over my shoulder whenever I walked anywhere. Even now, I can't get his face out of my head. The way he stared, so calm, like he had all the time in the world. I always liked running early in the morning. It was quiet, the air felt fresh, and the streets were mostly empty. My usual route took me through a small park about a mile from my apartment. It wasn't big, just a couple of winding paths, some benches, and a lot of trees, but it was peaceful, especially at that time of day. I'd been running there for months and never had any issues. That morning felt like any other. It was just past 5:30 a.m., and the sun was barely starting to rise. I had my usual playlist going, the one I always used to get into a rhythm. The streets were still dark, and the only people I saw were the occasional dog walkers or another runner here and there. When I reached the park, I turned onto the main path, letting my feet fall into their usual pace. I noticed him about halfway through the park. He was standing near a bench, just off the path. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone. He wasn't doing anything, no phone, no dog, nothing. Just standing there, looking straight ahead. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way he stood caught my attention. Too still. Too rigid. I kept running, telling myself not to overthink it. Plenty of people use the park, and not everyone looks friendly first thing in the morning. As I got closer, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. He was looking at me. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't change my pace. Just kept running. My music was still playing, but I turned the volume down low so I could hear if he said or did anything. He didn't move as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. About 20 steps past him, I looked over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still standing there, but now he had turned around. He was watching me. I told myself to focus. It was early, and maybe he was just out for a walk and curious about someone running by. I'd seen plenty of people in the park who seemed out of place. It didn't mean anything. But then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be someone else entering the park from another direction. I told myself not to panic, not to assume. But when I glanced back again, I saw him. He was walking now, heading in the same direction I was. Not running, not rushing. Just walking. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet behind me, but he was there. I sped up a little, trying to create more distance between us. I told myself to stick to my route, not to change anything. If he was just walking, I'd be out of the park before he could get anywhere near me. I reached the end of the path and took the usual left turn toward the exit. When I glanced back again, he had turned too. My heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been from just running. I wasn't winded, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to keep running, to act like nothing was wrong. But every time I looked back, he was still there. Always just far enough that it felt like I couldn't say anything or confront him, but close enough that I couldn't shake him. When I finally exited the park, I felt a small wave of relief. The street ahead was wider, brighter. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I thought about stopping, waiting for him to pass, but something told me that would be worse. I didn't want him to know I was scared. I kept running, heading toward the busier part of my route. There was a gas station about a quarter mile up. It was small, but the lights were always on, and there was usually someone inside. I decided I'd stop there if he was still following me. I didn't have to look back anymore. I could hear his footsteps now. They were steady, matching my pace. Not speeding up, not slowing down. Just following. When I reached the gas station, I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply and went straight inside. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see someone this early. I walked to the back, pretending to grab a bottle of water, but really just trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stayed back there for a minute or two before glancing toward the door. He was standing outside. He wasn't looking in, just standing by the edge of the parking lot, like he was waiting for me to come out. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, but I didn't want to leave while he was still there. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I almost told him what was going on. But what could he do? Call the police because someone was walking behind me? After a few minutes, the man outside moved. He didn't leave, just shifted closer to the building, standing by the corner where I couldn't see him unless I walked out. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked to the counter and told the clerk there was a man outside who had been following me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The clerk frowned, looking toward the door, then nodded. He told me to stay inside while he went to check. I watched as he stepped out, looking around. The man was gone. The clerk came back in and told me there was no one there, but I could tell he believed me. He asked if I needed him to call someone or if I wanted to wait for a ride. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call a friend. I didn't care that it was early. I just needed someone to pick me up. While I waited, I stayed near the counter, my eyes glued to the parking lot. My friend showed up about 10 minutes later, and I ran straight to their car, not looking back. I told them everything on the ride home, and they insisted on staying with me for the rest of the day. I didn't go running for a while after that. When I finally did, I chose a different route, one with more people and fewer places to hide. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of those footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Like he was waiting for something. When I checked into the hotel, it was already late. I'd been driving all day, and all I wanted was to take a shower and sleep. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just one of those chain places off the highway, but it looked clean enough from the outside. The woman at the front desk was polite. She handed me my key card, smiled, and told me my room was on the 3rd floor. The elevator creaked a bit on the way up, but I didn't think much of it. When I got to my room, I slid the key card in, and the little green light blinked. I pushed the door open, but it stopped short, like something was blocking it. At first, I thought maybe the door was sticking or the latch hadn't fully disengaged. I gave it another push, harder this time, and it opened enough for me to see inside. There was a man standing in the middle of the room. I froze. He didn't look surprised to see me, and that was the first thing that set me on edge. He just stood there, calm, like he'd been expecting me. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't doing anything threatening, but the way he stared, it was cold, detached. "This is my room," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked a little. He didn't respond. Just stood there, watching me. I glanced down the hallway, half expecting someone to jump out and say this was some kind of prank, but it was empty. Did they give you the wrong room too? I asked, trying again, even though I already knew something wasn't right. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then, finally, he spoke. This room is occupied. I felt a chill run through me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, deliberate. Like he wasn't telling me, but warning me. I just checked in, I said, stepping back into the hallway. There must be some kind of mistake. He didn't answer. I slowly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and headed straight back to the elevator. When I got back to the front desk, the woman looked up, surprised to see me. I told her there was someone in my room. At first, she seemed confused, but then she frowned and started typing on her computer. That's not possible, she said after a moment. Room 314 hasn't been checked out to anyone. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, but she just looked back at me like she didn't believe me. I'm telling you, there's a man in there, I said. He said the room was occupied. She hesitated, then picked up the phone and called someone. I couldn't hear much of the conversation, but she kept glancing at me, her brow furrowed. When she hung up, she said she'd send someone up to check. She offered me a new room in the meantime, but I wasn't sure I even wanted to stay there anymore. A maintenance worker met me at the elevator a few minutes later. He had a key of his own and told me to stay in the hallway while he checked a room. I watched as he opened the door and stepped inside. He was in there for what felt like forever, and when he finally came back out, he looked at me, confused. There's no one in there, he said. I didn't believe him. I saw him, I insisted. He was standing right in the middle of the room. The worker just shrugged. Maybe he left before I got here. Door's clear now, though. I didn't want to go back in, but the thought of leaving without my things, my suitcase, my laptop, kept me rooted there. The worker handed me my key card and left, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. No sign of a man, no sign anyone had been there. My suitcase was still where I'd left it by the door, untouched. The bed was made, the bathroom light was off, and nothing looked out of place. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and even dragged the desk chair in front of it, just in case. I didn't feel safe, but I didn't know what else to do. I tried to convince myself that maybe the worker was right, that the man had just slipped out while I was downstairs. But then I noticed something. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes. It was subtle, but definitely there. The hotel was non-smoking, and I hadn't smelled it when I first walked in. I checked the trash can, the bathroom, even under the bed, but there was nothing. No ashtray, no butt, nothing. I tried to shake it off and focus on getting ready for bed. I took the fastest shower of my life, keeping the bathroom door locked and the curtain half open so I could see out. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on, even though I knew it wouldn't really make a difference. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump, the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of the building settling, even my own breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a soft noise. It took me a second to realize what it was. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle was moving. My heart felt like it stopped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the chair scraped against the floor. Then I heard the lock click, and the door creaked open an inch before catching on the chain. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it. They just stood there, silent. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When the woman answered, I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room. She said she'd send security up immediately. I didn't move until I heard footsteps in the hallway and a man's voice calling out, asking if everything was okay. When I opened the door, there were 2 security guards standing there. I told them what happened, and they checked the hallway, but it was empty. The only thing they found was the chair, still sitting in the middle of the room. I checked out first thing in the morning. The woman at the desk apologized and said she didn't know how it could have happened. She offered me a refund, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I still don't know who that man was or how he got into the room. The door had been locked, and the only key card should have been mine in the hotel's. But I know what I saw, and I know someone tried to come back later that night. It started out as a dumb idea. My friends dared me to hide out in the department store after closing. They said I wouldn't last an hour alone after the lights went off. We'd been hanging out at the mall all afternoon, and by the time we came up with the plan, it was almost closing time. They left before the staff started their final rounds, leaving me alone to figure out how to stay unnoticed. I found a spot behind a rack of winter coats in the men's section. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and the coats hung low enough to block me from sight. I crouched there, waiting, listening as the last announcements played overhead and the store got quieter. Eventually, I heard the sound of the security gates rolling down at the entrances. When everything was silent, I crawled out. The store looked strange in the dark, all shadows and empty aisles. It wasn't scary, not yet. Mostly, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I walked through the aisles, trying not to make too much noise. My plan was to stay for a couple of hours, take a few pictures to prove I'd done it, and then sneak out when the gates reopened in the morning. I headed to the electronics section first. The TV displays were off, but a few laptops were still on, their screens casting faint blue light. I took out my phone to record a video, whispering into the mic about how I was all alone. That's when I heard the first noise, a sharp, metallic clink, like a door handle being turned. I froze, holding my breath, and looked around. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, so I told myself it was just part of the store settling. I kept walking, heading toward the toy section. That's when I saw the flashlight. It was faint at first, a beam of light sweeping across the floor on the far side of the store. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about security. I figured they'd just lock the doors and leave, maybe check the cameras once in a while. But someone was definitely inside, moving through the aisles. I ducked behind a shelf and tried to think. If they caught me, I'd be in trouble. Maybe not arrested, but definitely banned from the mall, and my parents would kill me. I decided to wait until the light passed and then find a better hiding spot until the person left. But the light didn't pass. It got closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wasn't in any hurry. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the back of the shelf. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, listening. Then I heard a voice. "I know you're in here." It wasn't loud, but it carried through the silence of the store. The tone was flat, almost casual, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "I saw you on the cameras," the voice continued. "Come out now, and this will be easy." I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear it. I peeked through a gap in the shelves and saw the flashlight beam swinging back and forth. The man holding it was wearing a uniform, but it didn't look like the mall security I'd seen before. His shirt was too loose, untucked, and there was no badge. just a dark shape stitched over the pocket. He walked past my aisle, the light sweeping dangerously close to where I was hiding. I stayed frozen, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. After a few seconds, he moved on, but I didn't feel safe. Something about him wasn't right. When I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, I crept out and headed toward the back of the store, where the employee-only area was. My new plan was to hide in the stockroom until morning. The store's cameras couldn't see back there, and I figured the man wouldn't bother checking. The stockroom was cold and smelled like cardboard. Rows of shelves stretched out in every direction, filled with boxes and loose items. I found a spot behind a stack of pallets and sat down, trying to calm myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. There was a message from one of my friends. "Did you chicken out yet?" I started typing a reply when I heard the sound of a door opening nearby. The stockroom door. I shoved my phone into my pocket and scrambled deeper into the pallets, crouching low. The man's footsteps were heavier now, echoing in the quiet space. His flashlight beam cut through the gaps between the shelves, searching. He didn't say anything this time, just walked slowly, methodically. I realized then that he wasn't looking for a thief or someone breaking the rules. He was hunting. I held my breath as the light passed over the pallets where I was hiding. It lingered for a second, then moved on. The footsteps grew fainter, and I thought he might be leaving, but then they stopped. "Do you think I won't find you?" he said. His voice was closer than I expected. "This is my place. My rules." I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't stay there. If he found me, I didn't think he'd just kick me out. There was something wrong with him, something dangerous. I waited until his light moved away, then crawled out from my hiding spot and headed toward the exit. I made it back to the sales floor without being seen. The store was even darker now, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I moved as quickly as I could, trying to stay quiet. The front doors were just ahead, and I could see the faint glow of the mall's lights beyond the gates. I thought I was going to make it. Then I heard the sound of keys jingling behind me. I turned and saw the man standing at the edge of the aisle. He wasn't shining his flashlight anymore, but I could see him clearly enough. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "Leaving already?" he asked. I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the front doors, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. I heard him running behind me, his footsteps faster now, closing the distance. When I reached the gate, I grabbed the bars and shook them, but they didn't budge. The locks were solid, and there was no way I could squeeze through. I looked around, desperate for another way out, and saw the fire exit sign glowing in the distance. I sprinted for it, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The man was still behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the fire exit, I slammed into the bar and pushed it open. The alarm blared, deafening, but I didn't care. I ran outside into the cold night air, my chest heaving. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot. When I finally turned around, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, the alarm blaring behind him, until I was out of sight. I never told anyone what happened. Not my friends, not my parents. I don't even know if they would have believed me. I came home from work just after dark. It had been one of those long days where your brain feels fried, and all I wanted to do was get inside, put my stuff down, and relax. I didn't notice anything unusual until I pulled into my driveway. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was a pile of trash or something. There was a person sitting cross-legged on the pavement, right in front of the garage door. They didn't move when my headlights hit them. They were holding a cardboard sign propped up against their knees, and the words on it were scrawled in big black marker. "I know what you did." I froze for a second, foot on the brake, engine still running. The words didn't make sense to me. I stared at them, trying to figure out if I was reading it wrong. The person didn't move. They were sitting perfectly still, like they were a mannequin. I thought about backing out, driving away, but I told myself this was probably some weird joke or a mix-up. Maybe they had the wrong house. Maybe it was some kind of prank. I rolled down the window a crack and called out, "Can I help you?" They didn't answer. I couldn't even tell if they heard me. Their face was shadowed under a hood, but I could tell they were looking straight at me. That much was clear. I tried again, louder this time. "You're on private property. You need to leave." Nothing. Just silence. I turned off the engine, but I didn't get out of the car. My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure why. I told myself it was probably just some harmless person trying to make a statement about something. Maybe they were protesting. Maybe they thought this was someone else's house. I grabbed my phone and started to dial the non-emergency police line, but then I stopped. What was I even going to say? That there was a person sitting in my driveway with a sign? They weren't doing anything illegal, at least not yet. I honked the horn, short and sharp, to see if that would startle them or get them to move. It didn't. They just sat there, holding the sign steady, not even flinching. I decided to get out. I figured it would be better to confront them face to face and tell them to leave. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call someone if things went south. When I stepped out, the cold air hit me, and everything felt quieter than usual, like the world had pressed pause. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you're doing here, but you need to go. If you don't, I'm calling the police." The person didn't answer. They didn't even look like they were breathing. I took a cautious step closer, staying out of arm's reach. "Did you hear me? This is my property. You can't just sit here." Still nothing. I could feel my frustration rising, mixing with the unease that had been building since I first saw them. I wanted to grab the sign, rip it out of their hands, and see if that would snap them out of whatever weird game they were playing. But I didn't. Instead, I tried a different approach. "I think you have the wrong house," I said. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything." That's when they moved. Not much, just a small tilt of their head, like they were considering what I said. Then they raised a gloved hand and pointed at the sign. "I know what you did." A chill ran through me. The words looked different now, heavier somehow. I tried to remember if I'd done anything that could have been misinterpreted, anything that might have upset someone. Nothing came to mind. I was just an ordinary person living an ordinary life. I stepped back and called out, "I'm calling the police. You need to leave now." I dialed and waited for the operator to pick up. As I explained the situation, I kept my eyes on the person. They didn't move. The operator said an officer would be dispatched, but it might take a while. I thanked them and hung up, my hands trembling as I put the phone back in my pocket. I leaned against my car, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, and the person didn't budge. I checked my watch. It felt like forever, but in reality, only 5 minutes had gone by. Finally, I heard the sound of a car approaching. Blue and red lights flashed as a patrol car pulled up behind mine. 2 officers stepped out, one of them shining a flashlight at the figure in my driveway. The first officer called out, "Hey, you need to stand up and identify yourself." The person didn't respond. The second officer approached cautiously, hand resting on their holster. When they got closer, they reached out and pulled the hood back, revealing a man's face, blank, pale, and expressionless. "Sir, we're going to need you to stand up," the officer said firmly. The man slowly rose to his feet, still holding the sign. His movements were deliberate, almost robotic. The first officer took the sign from him, glancing at it before handing it to the other officer. "Do you have any ID?" the officer asked. The man shook his head. He didn't speak, didn't even try to explain himself. They started asking him more questions, but he didn't answer. Eventually, they handcuffed him and put him in the back of the patrol car. One of the officers stayed behind to talk to me. He asked if I recognized the man or knew why he might have been there. I told him I had no idea. I asked if they found anything on him, but the officer just shook his head. "He's not talking," he said. "We'll take him in and see if we can figure out who he is." After they left, I stood in my driveway, staring at the spot where the man had been sitting. The sign was still there, lying on the ground where the officer had dropped it. I picked it up, hesitated, and then carried it inside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, the sign propped up against the coffee table. The words felt like they were staring at me, accusing me of something I couldn't remember. The next morning, I called the police station to ask if they'd learned anything about the man. The person on the phone told me he was released after a few hours. No ID, no criminal record, no explanation for what he was doing. They couldn't hold him. I hung up and stared out the window. My driveway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back. Even now, every time I come home, I half expect to see him sitting there again, waiting, holding another sign. It started as just another drive home from work. The kind of uneventful commute you don't even think about. I was merging onto the highway when a black SUV cut me off. I hit the brakes hard, my seatbelt digging into my chest, and I leaned on the horn without even thinking about it. I wasn't angry, really, just startled. The driver threw up a hand, like they were waving me off, and I thought that was the end of it. A couple of miles later, I noticed the SUV again. They were hanging in my blind spot, then speeding up to stay even with me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at them, but the windows were tinted too dark to see anything. I didn't think much of it until they swerved closer, like they were trying to nudge into my lane. I moved over into the right lane just to get away from them, but they followed, sticking right behind me this time. At that point, I started to feel uneasy. I checked the time, 6:30 p.m., and figured maybe they were just in a hurry to get somewhere, but my stomach was tight. I decided to ignore them and keep driving. If they were trying to mess with me, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. But then they started following me off the highway. My exit wasn't busy, just a small turnoff that led into a residential area. I didn't think it was strange until I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them right there, just a car length behind me. There were no other cars around, no reason for them to be on my tail like that. I made a left at the light, and so did they. I made a right at the next street, and they stayed with me. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But then I took another left, this time into a random neighborhood I didn't even know, and they followed. I drove in circles for a while, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But no matter how many turns I made, they were there, close enough for me to see their headlights in my mirror. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, so did they. I decided to test it. At the next intersection, I pulled into a gas station and parked right in front of the convenience store, where it was bright and busy. The SUV passed by without stopping, and I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But then, not even 2 minutes later, they circled back and pulled into the lot, parking just a few spaces away. I couldn't see who was inside. The windows were still too dark. I stared at the car, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my lap, and I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know what to say. "Hey, I think someone's following me," sounded ridiculous. Instead, I got out and went into the store, my keys clutched tight in my hand. I lingered by the counter, pretending to browse the candy display while I kept an eye on the door. The SUV stayed parked outside. Nobody got out. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, I took a long route back to my car, walking through the rows of pumps to avoid getting too close to the SUV. I climbed in and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I decided to head toward the main road, where it was busier. If they followed me again, at least there'd be witnesses. Sure enough, as soon as I pulled out, the SUV did too. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I merged into traffic, trying to act like I didn't notice them. That's when they started speeding up. I was doing 40 in a 35, and they were getting closer, their headlights bright in my rearview mirror. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but they matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. I switched lanes, hoping they'd pass, but instead, they swerved into the same lane and honked. It felt like my chest was caving in. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what I'd done to make them so angry. Was it the horn? Was it because I cut them off earlier? I couldn't remember doing anything wrong. I spotted a police station up ahead and turned into the parking lot without thinking. The SUV slowed down but didn't follow me in. They rolled past, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a large figure, maybe a man, but I couldn't be sure. I stayed in the lot for a while, waiting for my nerves to settle. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, I didn't see the SUV anywhere. I decided to take a longer route home, just to be safe. I stuck to busy streets and well-lit areas, glancing in my mirrors every few seconds. I thought I'd lost them. I really did. But when I turned onto my street, there they were, parked a few houses down from mine. My stomach dropped. I drove past my house, not wanting them to know where I lived. Instead, I went around the block and parked in someone else's driveway, crouching low in my seat. The SUV idled for a minute before pulling away. I waited until I couldn't see their taillights anymore, then backed out and drove straight to a friend's house. I didn't go home that night. I didn't even tell my friend what happened. I just made up some excuse about needing company and stayed on their couch, staring at the ceiling until morning. The next day, I filed a report with the police. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or a clearer description of the driver. I started noticing SUVs everywhere after that, at intersections, in parking lots, parked along my route to work. Each time, my stomach would clench, and I have to remind myself that it probably wasn't them. I never saw the black SUV again after that, but I still think about it every time I get in my car. Every time I glance in the mirror and see headlights too close behind me. I still wonder who they were, what they wanted, and why they stopped following me when they did. I don't know if I'll ever get those answers. The hike started out normal. It was me and my best friend, Kevin, on a weekend trip to a national park we've been talking about for months. We planned a 2-night trek through some of the quieter trails. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a way to get away from work and all the noise of daily life. The first day went smooth. We made it to the campsite early, set up the tent, and had plenty of time to relax by the fire. The trail wasn't too crowded, and we only passed a few groups along the way. It felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't really get in the city. The second morning, as we were packing up to move to the next site, a group of 4 people came through. 2 guys, 2 women. They looked about our age, maybe a little older. Their gear was worn, like they'd done this kind of thing before, and they were friendly enough at first. One of the guys, tall with a shaved head, called out a greeting, and they stopped to chat. Kevin's always more social than me, so he did most of the talking. They asked where we were headed, how long we'd been out, all the usual stuff. I thought it was fine, but something about the way they kept glancing at our gear put me on edge. Like they were sizing it up. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. After a few minutes, they said goodbye and continued down the trail. Kevin waved, and we finished packing. It wasn't until we got moving that I realized they were going the same direction we were. We catch glimpses of them ahead, their voices carrying through the trees, but we kept our distance. When we reached our next site, they were already there. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing by a stream, but it was big enough for multiple groups. They waved when they saw us, and Kevin waved back. I wasn't thrilled about sharing the space, but it's public land, and we didn't have much choice. As we set up our tent, the group came over again. They were still friendly, offering us some of their trail mix and asking if we needed help with anything. The tall guy, he introduced himself as Jay, even complimented Kevin's tent, saying it looked sturdy. I just nodded along, keeping my answers short. Something about them felt off. Too nice, maybe. Like they were trying too hard. That night, we ate our dinner and sat by our own fire, trying to keep to ourselves. The other group set up a little farther away, but they were loud, laughing and talking like they were at a party. It didn't bother Kevin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. When we woke up the next morning, I found one of our water bottles was missing. I thought maybe Kevin had moved it, but he swore he hadn't touched it. It didn't make sense. We packed everything up before bed. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't help thinking about the other group. We packed up and started the last leg of the hike. The trail was harder that day, with more steep climbs and rocky paths. About an hour in, Kevin's bootlace snapped. It wasn't a huge deal, but he swore it had been fine the night before. We stopped so he could fix it, and while we were sitting there, the other group caught up to us. Jay grinned and asked if we needed help again. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on our packs, and I felt my skin crawl. One of the women, short, with curly hair, offered Kevin some duct tape for his boot. He thanked her, and they moved on, disappearing down the trail. We started walking again, and I kept replaying everything in my head. The missing water bottle. Kevin's bootlace. Little things, but they didn't sit right. I told Kevin, but he shrugged it off, saying I was paranoid. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't relax. Around midday, we stopped for a break at a small clearing. I opened my pack to grab a snack and found my food bag had been opened. Not all of it was gone, but enough to notice. Kevin's bag was untouched, and he looked at me like I was losing it when I pointed it out. Probably a raccoon, he said, brushing crumbs off his pants. But my bag had been inside my pack, zipped up tight. There was no way an animal had gotten to it without making a mess. We kept walking, and the trail got narrower, with thick trees on either side. I started to notice the sounds of footsteps behind us. Light, like someone trying to be quiet. I stopped a few times, pretending to adjust my pack, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. By late afternoon, we reached the last site. It was more isolated than the others, surrounded by woods on three sides. The stream was dry, which made me even more nervous. We were low on water, thanks to the missing bottle, and the next source was miles away. As we set up camp, I kept scanning the trees, expecting the other group to show up again. They didn't, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I told Kevin we should leave, but he laughed, saying I was overreacting. That night, as we were falling asleep, I heard voices outside the tent. Low, murmuring voices, too far away to make out but close enough to know they were there. I shook Kevin awake, but by the time he listened, the voices had stopped. He told me it was just the wind and rolled over. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, circling the tent. Slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the steps faded, and I finally dozed off. When we woke up, the tent stakes were missing. The whole thing had collapsed on one side. Kevin cursed, saying it must have been animals again, but I knew better. Someone had pulled them out while we were sleeping. We packed up in record time and started hiking back toward the car. I felt exposed, like eyes were on us the whole way. Kevin tried to lighten the mood, joking about my wild imagination, but I could tell he was uneasy too. About a mile from the parking lot, we found one of our missing water bottles on the side of the trail. It was empty, the cap lying a few feet away. Kevin stopped laughing after that. We didn't see the other group again, but I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching us, just out of sight. When we finally reached the car, I felt like I could breathe again. We threw our gear in the trunk and didn't stop driving until we were hours away from the park. I don't know what they wanted or why they were messing with us, but I haven't gone camping since. Every time I think about it, I get this sinking feeling, like we barely made it out. Like they were testing how far they could push us. And I don't want to know what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I've been debating whether or not to share this for months. I'm not the type to post stuff like this, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like someone else needs to hear it. Maybe it'll help someone avoid what I went through. It started on a Wednesday evening. I was on my way home from work, driving down a quiet stretch of highway. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to getting back to my apartment. The sun had just set, and the road was mostly empty. I had the radio on low, kind of zoning out, when I saw the lights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was on a highway, and there are a lot of police around, so it seemed normal. But then I noticed something odd. The lights weren't the usual red and blue I was used to seeing from real police cars. They were a little dimmer, almost orange. And the car wasn't a patrol car, at least, not one I recognized. It was a plain, dark sedan, and the headlights were unusually bright, almost blinding. I checked my speed. I wasn't speeding, at least I didn't think I was. But I decided to pull over anyway. Better to be safe than sorry. I switched on my hazard lights and slowed to a stop on the side of the road. My mind was still racing, trying to figure out why I'd been pulled over when I hadn't done anything wrong. The car behind me stopped, and I saw the figure in my rearview mirror. The person walking up to my car was wearing a police uniform, but something about him felt off. It wasn't just the lights or the car, it was his presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark blue shirt and a bulletproof vest, the kind I've seen officers wear. But he didn't have a badge on his shirt, which I thought was strange. and the way he was walking kind of stiff, like he was trying to appear more official than he really was. He reached my window, and I cracked it just enough to hear him. "License and registration, please," he said in a calm, almost rehearsed voice. He didn't sound rude, just neutral, like he was reading a script. I asked him why I was being pulled over, and he gave me a vague answer about routine checks and safety. That didn't sit right with me. I asked him again if I had done something wrong, and he just repeated the same thing, barely looking at me. I handed over my license and registration because I didn't want to argue. But the whole situation felt off. As he walked back to his car, I sat there, staring at the dashboard. Something in my gut told me this wasn't right. The lights, the car, his behavior, it wasn't adding up. I looked around. There weren't any other cars on the road. No other police vehicles, no other signs of authority. Just me, parked on the side of a dark highway with a guy who, at this point, could have been anyone. I thought about driving off, but I didn't want to escalate things. I mean, I wasn't exactly sure what I'd be dealing with. So, I stayed put. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching as he stood by his car, talking into a radio or something, but his back was to me. His posture was stiff, and for a moment, I thought I saw him glance at me. I don't know why, but that made me feel even more uneasy. When he came back to my car, he handed me my registration and license and told me to stay put. His tone had changed now. It was sharper, more commanding. He asked me to step out of the car, which struck me as odd. I wasn't sure if I should, but then he said something about standard procedure, and I didn't want to seem uncooperative. I got out of my car, but as soon as I stood up, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something in his eyes told me I was in danger. I took a step back, my mind running through every possible scenario. He wasn't acting like a normal cop. There was no cruiser, no real reason for me to get out of my car, and my gut told me I shouldn't trust him. He told me to turn around and face the car, and I did. But as I stood there, I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I was getting more anxious, and I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I fight back? My hands were shaking, but I stayed still, listening to every little sound around me. Then, without warning, I heard him say, "You're going to have to come with me." His voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it carried a tone that I knew meant he wasn't giving me a choice. I spun around, facing him. My heart was racing, my mind screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't move. He was standing there, close, too close, and I could see the slight smirk on his face. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't a real cop. Before I could react, he reached for something under his vest, pulling out what looked like a badge, but it was too shiny, too new, like something someone had bought at a costume store. I don't even think it was a real badge, but it didn't matter. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and I took a step back, hoping my instincts would save me. He reached out, and that's when I saw it, a second figure, coming out from behind the sedan. A woman, tall and thin, wearing a black jacket. She had no badge, no uniform. Just a plain black hoodie, and she was walking toward me with purpose. "Get in the car," the man said again, his voice now hard. "This is your last warning." I don't know what made me do it, but I turned around and ran. I don't know how I moved so fast, but I sprinted toward my car, slamming the door open. I was shaking, my heart in my throat, but I didn't think. I just reacted. The engine roared to life, and I sped off before I even fully closed the door. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, watching me. The man didn't move, but the woman just stared, and I knew in that moment that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station. I pulled into the lot, my hands still shaking, and I called the police. When I explained what had happened, they told me that there had been no reported officer on the road in that area. No one fitting the description of the person I'd encountered. It's been weeks, and I still can't shake the feeling of those eyes on me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get away. I've thought about it every day since then, and the more I think about it, the more I feel like I barely made it out alive. It's taken me a long time to finally put this down, and even now, I'm not sure I can make sense of it. It feels strange to even talk about. I never thought something like this could happen, but it did, and I'm still not sure how to feel about it. It all started a few months ago when a new guy started working at the office. His name was Mark. I didn't think much of him at first, just another guy in the cubicles, trying to settle in. I noticed he seemed to be friendly, always asking questions, a little too eager to help. He would chat with me more than with anyone else, asking about my day, asking if I wanted coffee, offering to run small errands for me. He was nice enough, I guess, but I started feeling uncomfortable after a while. His attention was a little too much, too often. But I brushed it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. Then came the first strange thing. One day, I came into the office, and there was a small plant on my desk. Not just any plant either, a little succulent, in a ceramic pot with a handwritten note that said, "I thought this would make your day brighter." I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no name. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to sound ungrateful, but it felt odd, especially coming from someone I barely knew. Still, I thought maybe it was just a nice gesture. Maybe someone was just being friendly. Maybe I was overthinking it. The next day, another gift. A coffee mug. It wasn't the same as the plant this time. The mug was just a generic one, but it had my favorite color on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too specific. But again, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I put the mug in my cabinet and tried to forget about it. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Little notes, small gifts, always things that felt a little too personal. A new set of pens with my initials on them. A box of chocolates with a message that said, "For your sweet smile." It was always just the right amount of thoughtfulness to seem like a nice gesture, but at the same time, it always felt off. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate kindness, I did, but the more these gifts piled up, the more I felt trapped. I never knew how to respond, or even if I should. I started to notice Mark more. He'd be standing a little too close when he talked to me. He'd give me this odd, almost vacant smile whenever I tried to step away from him. There was something about his eyes that made me feel uneasy. But he was always polite, always professional, so I tried not to make a big deal out of it. After all, I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Then came the first incident that really made me uncomfortable. One evening, I was leaving work a little later than usual, and as I was walking to my car, I saw Mark standing in the parking lot. I figured maybe he was just waiting for someone else or having a smoke, but then I realized he was looking directly at me. Not just glancing over, but really watching. It was unnerving. When I waved and said goodbye, he didn't wave back. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. I brushed it off as weird timing. Maybe he was waiting for his ride, maybe he hadn't seen me leave. But the next day, when I got to work, there was another note on my desk. "I saw you leaving last night. You looked like you needed some fresh air." That was when my stomach dropped. How could he have known that unless he was watching me? I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just overreacting. but something was wrong. I didn't want to confront him, didn't want to make it awkward or escalate things, so I stayed quiet. But the weirdness continued. A few days later, while I was out running errands after work, I ran into him at a coffee shop. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so the coincidence felt off. He smiled at me, a little too eagerly. "I didn't know you came here," he said. "I love this place." I felt my stomach twist. "Yeah, it's a nice spot," I said, forcing a smile. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to be polite, but my mind was racing. Why was he here? How did he know this was where I liked to go? Things only escalated from there. Over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing him showing up in places I frequented, cafes, stores, even the gym. He never said anything when I saw him. He would just smile, wave, and act like it was the most normal thing in the world. But I was starting to get scared. It wasn't just the gifts anymore. It wasn't just the notes. It was the fact that he seemed to be following me. I tried to avoid him, taking different routes home, changing up my routine. But it didn't seem to matter. No matter where I went, Mark always seemed to be there. At first, it was easy enough to brush off as coincidence, but then I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. I came into work one morning to find a picture of myself sitting on my desk. It was a photo of me walking into a store the day before. He had taken it from a distance, but it was definitely me. There was a note attached. "I like the way you dress. You always look so nice." That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like I could trust anyone anymore, not even the people I worked with. I'd spent weeks trying to figure out how to handle it, but this was too much. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I went to my manager and told her everything. I showed her the pictures, the notes, the gifts. She was surprised, shocked even. She had no idea anything was going on. But I knew something had to be done. We decided to report it to HR, who in turn contacted the security team and said they would look into it. Mark was called into the office for a meeting the next day. And after that, he was never seen again. No one ever said what happened. There was no explanation, no word about whether he was let go or if there were any consequences. All I know is that he was gone, and the gifts stopped. The notes stopped. But I still feel uneasy sometimes. I still wonder if he's out there, watching me. It's hard to shake that feeling. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't know why he chose me. But I know I never want to go through something like that again. I don't think anyone should ever have to. It happened about a year ago, but I still think about it all the time. I had just turned 18 and was looking for extra cash. I was babysitting a little girl who was 6, I think, and her parents were nice enough. It was a simple job. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, and it wasn't far from my own place. I'd watched their daughter a few times before, so I was comfortable. The parents were going out to dinner, and everything was going fine. The little girl was watching some cartoons, and I was sitting on the couch with my phone, scrolling through some stuff. Around 8:30, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured maybe it was a neighbor or someone on the street who needed something. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there. He was maybe in his late 40s, a bit rough around the edges, wearing a worn-out jacket. He didn't seem like a threat, not at first. He looked at me and said, "Hey, I'm a friend of the family. I just need to talk to them for a minute." His voice was calm, but something about it made me feel uneasy. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just his face. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just flat. I told him the parents weren't home. He didn't really react to that. He just stood there for a second, then smiled slightly, a little too wide. "Are you sure?" he asked. There was something about the way he said it that made me feel like he wasn't just asking if the parents were home. It felt like he was asking if I was sure about something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told him again that they were out and that they'd be back soon. He looked over my shoulder into the house, but I didn't open the door all the way, just enough to talk through it. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my pulse picking up. It was a weird feeling, like I was suddenly aware that I was alone in the house with this guy standing there. He looked at me again and said, "I'll just wait then. I'll wait inside, it's no trouble." That's when something inside me clicked, and I knew I didn't want him in the house. I was supposed to be watching this little girl, and I didn't know who this man was. He didn't belong here. I didn't want to be rude, but I was getting nervous. "Sorry, I can't let you in," I said. "I'll call them for you if you'd like." He paused, and I could see him thinking. Then he said, "I'm sure they won't mind. I'm a friend. I've known them for years." His eyes moved to the side, like he was trying to look past me, but I didn't let him. I shook my head. "I'm really sorry. I'm just going to call them." I tried to sound as firm as I could, but I could feel my voice wavering. Before I could close the door, he quickly said, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I'll just wait here. No need to be like that." His tone was different now, more insistent, like I had done something wrong. I immediately shut the door, locked it, and leaned back against it. My heart was racing. I didn't know what was wrong with him, but I knew something was off. I grabbed my phone and called the parents. They were only supposed to be gone for another hour or so, but I needed to check with them. I called twice, but neither of them answered. I left a message saying I needed to talk to them about something. I felt my stomach twist. While I was waiting, I peeked through the curtains to see if the man was still there. He was standing on the porch, just looking down at the ground. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but he wasn't leaving. After a while, he knocked again, but I didn't answer. I just stayed still, hoping he would go away. Finally, the parents called me back. I told them about the man at the door, and they didn't seem to know who he was. I could hear the confusion in their voices. "Are you sure?" the mom asked. "We don't have anyone visiting tonight." I told her exactly what he said, that he was a friend of the family, and she didn't recognize the name he mentioned. They told me to stay inside and lock all the doors. I didn't need to be told twice. I moved quickly to double-check the locks on all the windows and doors. I don't think I've ever been more aware of how alone I felt in that house. I stayed near the little girl, who was still on the couch watching TV. I kept the volume low so I could hear anything that happened outside. The man knocked again, this time louder, and then started calling out, "Hey, I just want to talk to them. I'm not going to hurt you, I just need to talk to them." But he wasn't speaking with any kindness anymore. There was something in his voice, something cold that made me shiver. I didn't respond. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd give up and leave. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him walking away. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't hear any more knocks. I waited for a few minutes, making sure he was really gone before I dared to go to the door and check. When I opened the door just a crack, I saw him. He was standing at the end of the driveway, just looking back at me. He didn't wave or anything. He just stood there, his back to me, watching me from a distance. I closed the door quickly. I didn't know if he'd come back. I didn't know if he had any other reason for being there. But he didn't return, and when the parents got home, I told them everything. They said they didn't recognize him, but they called the police just in case. The police came and took a report, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know what he wanted or why he came to the house that night, but I don't think I'll ever forget the way his eyes looked when he was standing on the porch, and the way his voice changed when he insisted I let him in. I never babysat for that family again. It's been over a year, but I still get nervous when someone knocks at my door late at night. I don't know what would have happened if I'd opened it again. This happened last year, and it's still hard to shake off. I've never really told anyone about it, but now I feel like it's finally time to share. It all started one afternoon when I came home from work. I had a long day, nothing unusual, just the usual rush hour traffic and the stress of dealing with clients. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a package sitting by my front door. It was just a regular brown box, nothing special. I figured it was something I had ordered online. I couldn't remember what it was, but I was always getting small deliveries for different things, so it wasn't that odd. I didn't think twice about it. I grabbed the box and brought it inside. It was heavier than I expected, but I thought it might just be a few books or something. I set it down on the kitchen counter and looked at the label. It was addressed to someone I didn't know. The name was completely unfamiliar, and the return address didn't ring any bells either. I was confused, but I figured it was just a mistake from a delivery service. I figured I'd call them, explain the mix-up, and get it sorted. But something made me hesitate. I don't know why. Maybe it was because it was already in my house, or maybe I was just curious about what was inside. I tore off the tape, opened the box, and stared at what was inside. It wasn't what I expected at all. There was a large plastic bag filled with something wrapped in cloth. At first, I thought it was just a bunch of clothes, maybe some sort of donation item. But then I saw what was underneath the fabric. There were photographs. Old, faded ones, stacked on top of each other. Some of them were of people I didn't recognize, but others were of me. They were pictures taken from the street outside my house, from angles I knew were impossible unless someone had been watching me for a while. I could feel my heart start to race as I flipped through more of the pictures. There were shots of me walking my dog, getting into my car, even standing at my kitchen window. It was like someone had been following me for months. But that wasn't the worst part. Beneath the photos, there was something wrapped in more cloth. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully unwrapped it. It was a lock of hair. Long, dark hair. The kind that matched mine. My stomach twisted as I stared at it. It felt like the air had gotten heavy, suffocating. It didn't make sense. Why would someone send this to me? I set the box down, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I was about to call the police when I heard a knock at the door. I froze. I didn't know what to think. Who would knock at this time of day, especially after I'd just opened that box? I stood still for a second, wondering if maybe I was just being paranoid, but then I heard the knock again. More urgent this time. It wasn't a gentle knock, it was forceful, almost angry. I walked cautiously to the door, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing there. He looked normal enough, mid-40s, average build, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans. But his expression, his eyes were wide, frantic, like he was on the edge of something. He knocked again, louder this time. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Something about this didn't sit right. I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I stepped back, trying to stay calm. I was about to call the police when I heard the man speak through the door. "I know you have it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need it back." I didn't respond. My mind was racing. What the hell was he talking about? What did he want from me? "I saw you open it," he said, his voice trembling with panic now. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." I couldn't breathe. I knew it wasn't a coincidence that the package had come to my door. This man had sent it, and whatever was inside, whatever was happening, it was more than just a strange mistake. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "Give it back. Now." I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed with fear. My hands were shaking, and my mind was trying to think, to make sense of the situation. But there was no way I was going to let this man in, not after what I'd just seen. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I knew I needed to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. The man was still standing there, his silhouette barely visible through the glass. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he was still there. I called 911. My voice was shaky, and I couldn't get the words out fast enough. I told the dispatcher everything: the package, the photos, the hair, and the man at the door. They assured me help was on the way, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I heard the sirens. The man was still there when the police arrived, standing just outside my door, pacing. The officers asked me to stay back, and they quickly got the situation under control. The man didn't try to run. He just stood there, almost like he was waiting to be arrested. They took him into custody, but I didn't hear much about what happened after that. The police didn't give me many details. They took the box, the photos, and everything else, and said they would handle it. They assured me I was safe, but I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for so long, and the idea that he knew so much about me was horrifying. I never found out who the man was or why he'd sent the package. The police said it was part of an ongoing investigation, but I don't think I'll ever know the full truth. I've never had a delivery mistake like that again, but I'm always looking over my shoulder now. I never open a package without checking who it's for. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear a noise outside my window. I always wonder if it's him. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain this. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm driving through empty stretches of road. It happened a little over a year ago, but I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I've traveled alone a lot before, but this time, well, let me just tell you what happened. It was late at night. I was driving across the country, headed to a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of drive where you're miles away from any real civilization, just long stretches of dark roads and occasional small towns. I had been on the road for hours, and my gas gauge was starting to dip into the red, so I pulled off the main road to stop at a gas station I saw in the distance. I didn't think anything of it. The place looked normal enough from the outside, a small, rundown gas station with one of those old, flickering lights above the door. The only car at the pumps was a beat-up pickup truck with a thick layer of dirt on it. I parked near the pump and got out, stretching my legs and trying to shake off the exhaustion. I noticed the gas station attendant almost immediately. He was standing behind the counter inside, watching me as I walked up to the door. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap. He had the look of someone who'd been doing this job for years, probably in the middle of nowhere for most of his life. His eyes were wide, a little too wide, and he seemed jittery, like he was on edge. I couldn't help but feel a little off just from looking at him. I opened the door and walked inside. He was still watching me, but didn't say anything at first. I grabbed a bottle of water and some chips, then walked up to the counter. He didn't even ask how I was doing or if I needed anything else. Instead, he just looked at me and said, "You need to leave. You need to go. Now." I froze. I thought I heard him wrong. I glanced around, expecting maybe a big storm or something outside. But everything seemed fine. It was just dark, quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. I chuckled nervously, thinking he was joking, and asked, "What's wrong?" His voice dropped low, almost like a whisper. "Just leave. You don't want to be here when they come through." I didn't know what to make of it. I figured he was just some paranoid guy. Maybe he had a rough night or something. But the urgency in his voice, the way he kept looking at the window like he was expecting someone, it didn't feel right. I paid for my stuff quickly, thinking I should just get going, but when I turned to leave, I saw a truck pull up outside. It wasn't the beat-up pickup anymore. It was a black SUV, one of those big ones that look intimidating, like the kind of car you'd see in a movie when someone's trying to make a dramatic entrance. It rolled up slowly, stopping just a little too close to my car. I stepped outside, trying to stay calm. My first instinct was to just get in my car and leave. I wasn't looking to get into any weird situation in the middle of nowhere. But as I approached my car, the door of the SUV opened. A man got out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. He didn't say anything, just watched me. I could feel my stomach tighten, a weird, uneasy feeling creeping up on me. I walked faster, trying not to look directly at him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring right at me. My hand was on the door handle when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey!" I turned around. It was the gas station attendant, standing in the doorway now. "You need to leave. Get in your car and don't stop. Go." His face was pale, almost gray, and he was sweating. I could tell he was genuinely scared. I didn't know what to do. The man from the SUV was still watching me, not moving, not saying a word. I could see that he was just standing there like he was waiting for something, or maybe someone. I got in my car quickly, locking the door behind me. I started the engine, and just as I was about to put it in reverse, the man from the SUV stepped in front of my car. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching a little as I stopped just inches from him. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms starting to sweat as I stared at him, trying to figure out what to do. The attendant was still standing in the doorway of the gas station, watching us both. He didn't seem like he was going to intervene. He just stood there, his hands trembling. I didn't know if this guy was going to hurt me or what. I considered just driving off, even if I had to run him over, but something told me it wasn't a good idea. I was in the middle of nowhere, in a place I didn't know. The gas station attendant's warning was still ringing in my head, and I wasn't sure I wanted to take any chances. Finally, the man moved. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step back and gestured toward the road. He didn't say anything, but I could tell from the look on his face that he wanted me to go. I didn't need any more encouragement. I didn't wait for him to move completely out of the way. I just threw the car in reverse and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know who those people were, or what they were planning, but I've never felt so unsafe in my life. The gas station attendant's face kept flashing in my mind, his fear so palpable, like he knew something I didn't. Like he knew I had to leave before it was too late. I didn't stop anywhere else that night, and I didn't trust any more gas stations on that trip. I didn't feel safe, and I didn't want to find out what would have happened if I had stayed any longer. I still don't know what they were up to, and I don't think I want to. Sometimes, when I drive alone now, I wonder if I'll ever run into them again. It was supposed to be a simple, harmless adventure. A group of friends, bored with the usual weekend plans, decided to explore an abandoned construction site on the edge of town. We heard stories about it, mostly rumors, nothing solid about it being haunted or dangerous, but to us, it was just another place to check off our list of things to do. None of us thought anything serious would happen. We didn't expect to run into anyone, let alone someone who had been living there for who knows how long. The place had been deserted for years, no work being done on it. The concrete walls were half finished, the skeleton of the building rising up in jagged shapes where workers had clearly stopped. Broken windows, rusted metal, and piles of debris filled the area, making it feel like a ghost town. We thought it would be fun to just roam around, maybe snap some photos for the gram and see what was left behind. It was only supposed to be a quick trip. It was me, Chris, Danny, and Liam. We'd all been friends for a long time, and none of us had any qualms about sneaking into abandoned places. But this was different. We climbed over the gate at the edge of the site, which was easy enough since the lock was broken and the fence barely stood upright. The place felt off immediately, but none of us said anything. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the site, but we figured we'd be in and out before it got too dark. As we wandered deeper into the site, we joked and laughed. The silence was unsettling, though, in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't like other places we'd explored. There was something heavy in the air, like the kind of silence you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. It should have been a clue, but we didn't listen to our instincts. We were near the farthest corner of the site when we heard the noise. It was faint at first, just the sound of something dragging, like fabric scraping across concrete. I froze, turning to look at the others. Danny had already stopped, and Chris was squinting into the shadows, trying to see what it was. We didn't move at first. The sound came again, closer this time, and then we saw it. A figure stepped into view. It wasn't anyone we knew. He looked like he had just crawled out from one of the ruins. Dirty, ragged clothes, his face covered in a thick beard, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was dragging something behind him. No, not something. Someone. A bag, or maybe a tarp, but it looked like it was full of something heavy. We all stood still, unsure of what to do. My heart was hammering in my chest. Danny was the first to speak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wavering, but she tried to sound confident. The man didn't answer at first. He just stared at us, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he was trying to figure us out. "You shouldn't be here," he finally said, his voice low, almost too calm. There was a strange edge to it, like he was on the verge of something. We didn't move. None of us knew how to react. Was he a squatter? Was he living here, hiding out from something or someone? The air felt thick now, heavy with tension. It was clear that he wasn't happy to see us. "I said you shouldn't be here," he repeated, stepping forward. His eyes didn't leave ours. His hand reached down toward the bag at his side, but he didn't pull anything out. He just kept staring at us like he was waiting for someone to make the first move. I wanted to say something, to explain that we were just exploring, that we meant no harm. But my mouth was dry. I couldn't find the words. It was like the atmosphere had thickened around us, and I was suddenly too scared to speak. Chris took a step back, looking at the rest of us. His face was pale, and I could see him searching for an escape route in his mind. I could feel it, too. It wasn't safe anymore. The man's eyes narrowed as he saw Chris move. "No one's leaving," he said. His voice was much colder now, much more serious. Before any of us could react, he moved quickly, too quickly. He grabbed Liam by the arm, pulling him toward him with terrifying strength. Liam yelled, stumbling as the man yanked him forward, his hand tightening around his wrist like a vice. "Let him go!" Danny shouted, but the man didn't flinch. He dragged Liam with him to the nearby wall, slamming him against it with enough force that I heard a thud echo through the air. Liam was gasping for breath, clearly shocked, but still fighting back. His hands were free now, but the man was still holding him by the collar, pressing him against the crumbling concrete. "You don't belong here," the man said again, his voice cold and final. It all happened so fast. My mind was racing. I wanted to help Liam, but I didn't know what to do. Danny was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. I could feel my body shaking, and I couldn't seem to move. The man let go of Liam's collar and pushed him back, shoving him away like he was nothing more than an annoyance. Liam stumbled but didn't fall. The man looked at all of us, sizing us up. He took a slow, deliberate step back, still watching us. His hand slowly came up to his mouth, as if he were considering something. For a moment, there was silence. Then, he spoke again, his voice almost casual this time. "Get out. Now!" Before I changed my mind. We didn't wait around. We didn't argue. Without another word, we all turned and ran, sprinting back the way we had come. My heart was racing, and I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps heavy on the concrete. We didn't look back. We made it to the edge of the site, where the gate was. I don't think any of us stopped to breathe until we were out of the fence and onto the road. We didn't even slow down until we were far away, standing by the side of the road, trying to catch our breath. When I finally looked at the others, I saw how pale they were. We all knew we had barely made it out of that place, and none of us were going back. The man hadn't chased us. He hadn't shouted anything after us, but I could still feel his eyes on my back. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were, but I don't want to find out. It wasn't just a coincidence. He didn't want us there, and he made it clear. I don't know if he was living there or just hiding out, but whatever it was not a place for anyone else. It's been over a year now, but sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Would he have let us go, or would he have done something worse? I'm glad I don't have to find out. It happened a few months ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've told a few people about it, but I don't think anyone really gets how scary it was. I still don't fully understand how I ended up in that situation. It all started when I finished my work late one evening. I'm in marketing, and sometimes I'm stuck in the office for hours after everyone else leaves. It was around 11 p.m., and I just wanted to get home. Normally, I take the subway, but it was a Friday, and the trains always feel a little sketchy that late, so I decided to order a rideshare instead. I opened the app, booked a ride, and went outside to wait. I stood by the curb, scrolling through my phone, not really paying much attention to what was going on around me. I was tired and ready to get home. A few minutes later, I saw the car pull up. The app said the name and the car model, so I walked over to it and opened the door without thinking much about it. The driver, a man, looked a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He didn't seem unusual. He smiled at me when I got in, which I returned with a tired nod. He didn't say anything at first, so I just buckled my seatbelt and settled in, expecting to hear the usual small talk. But instead, he started driving without asking for confirmation or anything. It wasn't until we had driven for a few minutes that I noticed something was off. The route didn't feel familiar. I live in a part of the city that's pretty straightforward to get to from downtown, but we seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. I thought maybe he was taking an alternate route or something, but the streets were getting emptier and less familiar. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I had just misjudged the route in my tired state. But after about 10 minutes of driving down roads I didn't recognize, I started to get anxious. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond at first, just kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road. I tried again. "Hey, I think you missed my turn. Can you turn around?" That's when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "No, we're going the right way." I could hear a slight accent in his voice, but it was hard to place. His eyes stayed locked on the road. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Listen, I'm not sure where we're going, but I need to get home," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "Could you please turn around?" He glanced at me quickly, just a quick flick of his eyes, before looking back at the road. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll take care of it." I couldn't make sense of what was happening. At this point, I started to feel a little panicked. My phone was on the passenger seat beside me, and I considered texting a friend or calling someone. But something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to give him any reason to get more defensive or angry. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, passing familiar streetlights that grew more sparse the farther we went. The streets turned darker, and the buildings started to look less like the city and more like empty industrial areas. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is getting too far out. I need to go home." The driver didn't answer right away. The silence felt suffocating. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he said something so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "You'll be fine. Just relax." That's when I started to really panic. The rational part of me wanted to get out, but I didn't know where we were, and I had no idea if I'd even be able to get another ride back. There was nothing around us but dark roads. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. "Please let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "I need to get out of the car now." The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was aware of what I had said. He didn't speak for a long time, and I started to feel like I was suffocating in the small space. "Don't make this difficult," he finally said, his voice colder now. It was like a switch had flipped. "You'll get out when I say so." I couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. I was in a car with a stranger, headed somewhere I didn't know, with no way to get out. The panic hit me hard, and I started to think about what my options were. I could try to jump out when we stopped, but what if we were somewhere with no one around? What if he came after me? I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. The car slowed down, and I immediately braced myself. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't know if he was going to stop and let me go or if he was going to hurt me. "Stop the car," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Let me out right now." He glanced over at me again, but his expression hadn't changed. It was like he was enjoying my fear. "We're almost there," he said, as if I should just trust him. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone and started tapping furiously. I knew I had to make a call, even if it was just to alert someone to what was happening. I dialed 911, trying to keep my hand steady as the car turned onto an even darker road. Before I could say anything to the dispatcher, the driver jerked the wheel, making the car swerve slightly. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes with a menacing glare. "Hang up," he ordered. "Now!" I didn't even think. I hit the red button to end the call. My heart was thundering in my chest. I had no idea if I had just made things worse or saved myself. I took a deep breath and tried to gather myself. I needed to act quickly. "Listen," I said, my voice much more firm now. "I'm going to call the police. You can't do this." He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. It was almost like he had made up his mind about something. Finally, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. "Get out," he said flatly. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, ran out of the car, and didn't stop until I was far enough away that I could barely see the car's headlights in the distance. My legs felt like jelly, and I was breathing so fast I thought I might pass out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I don't know if I'd be here writing this. But I never took a rideshare again after that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. I've been debating whether or not I should post this. It feels too weird to even talk about, but it's something that's been haunting me since it happened. I don't even know if I can make anyone understand just how strange and unsettling it was. But I have to get it off my chest. My boyfriend, Ben, and I were looking for a quiet weekend getaway. We've been dating for a little over a year, and we both needed a break from work. Something peaceful, somewhere remote, away from the noise of the city. We found this Airbnb listing in the middle of nowhere, an isolated cabin in a small rural town, with nothing around it but woods. Perfect for getting away from everything, or so we thought. The place looked charming in the photos, rustic and cozy, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and big windows. The host's profile was friendly enough, and the reviews were good, though there weren't many. The ones that were there seemed fine, nothing that stood out as unusual. So, we booked it. It was about a 4-hour drive, and we didn't mind the isolation. It felt like a perfect escape. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin sat by itself on a dirt road surrounded by dense trees, the kind of place you wouldn't want to be caught in after dark. But it looked charming, and the air smelled fresh. The first impression was good. The host, a man named Earl, greeted us. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with graying hair and a warm smile. He gave us a brief tour of the place, showing us the main living area, the kitchen, the bedroom, and a couple of other rooms. The cabin was small but nice, with just enough room for us to settle in and relax. Earl told us that if we needed anything, to just let him know, and that he'd leave us to enjoy the place. It was all very normal until he mentioned something about a crawl space. "Just be careful up there," he said, pointing to a small door in the ceiling of the hallway. "It's a little tight. I've kept it locked up for years. You don't need to worry about it." I didn't think much of it at the time. We were just looking forward to a quiet weekend, and the mention of a locked crawl space didn't seem all that strange. Earl left after showing us everything, and we were left to ourselves. That evening, we settled in. Ben and I had some drinks, cooked a simple dinner, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It was nice. We went to bed early, both of us glad to have a break. But around 3 a.m., I woke up for no particular reason. I didn't hear anything, but I just couldn't fall back to sleep. I tossed and turned for a while, then decided to go to the bathroom. When I walked down the hallway toward the bathroom, I saw just a small, faint light coming from the edge of the crawlspace door. It was cracked open, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. At first, I figured I had imagined it. Maybe I was just half asleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached it slowly, leaning in close. I could hear faint rustling, almost like something shifting inside. Maybe it was just an animal or the house settling, but it was enough to make me hesitate. I didn't want to wake Ben up, but my curiosity won out. I reached up to open the door and peered inside. The crawl space was small, barely tall enough to crouch in. It was dark, but the dim light from the hallway cast just enough glow for me to make out the edges of the space. There was a small, dusty box in the far corner. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, climbed up onto the ladder, and opened it. The box was filled with photographs, old ones. I could tell they were from different decades, ranging from the 90s to maybe the early 2000s. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were just regular pictures, people standing in front of the cabin, smiling. But then I looked closer at the backs of the photos. Each photo had notes written on it in small, neat handwriting. Stayed here July 15th, 2003, nice couple. December 12th, 1998, great guests, quiet. The more I flipped through, the worse it got. There were newer photos, two people I didn't recognize, but they were all taken at the cabin, smiling in front of the porch, or by the fireplace, or sitting on the couch. But as I went through them, something started to feel off. The notes began to change. The writing got darker. Stayed here November 3rd, 2011, he was nervous the whole time. June 6th, 2005, she kept looking out the window all night. And then, I found one that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of a woman, smiling like the others, but the note on the back was chilling. She never came back. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. There were several more like that. People who never came back or left early without explanation. I don't know why I kept reading, but I did. I heard a sound behind me. It was soft, but I could tell it wasn't just the owls settling. I turned around, feeling that panic rise in my chest. There, standing in the hallway, was Earl. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he was staring at me without saying a word. "Earl?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" He didn't respond at first. He just walked toward me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence was deafening. "Those people," he finally said, his voice cold, "they didn't leave." Not all of them. I didn't know what to say. I backed away from the crawl space, the box still in my hands. "What are you talking about?" Earl's face twisted in a way I'll never forget. He looked almost sad, like he was apologizing for something, but his eyes were calculating. "You weren't supposed to find that. You should have stayed away." I could barely breathe. I took another step back, but he was already standing too close. I didn't know what he was capable of. "You need to leave," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Now." I didn't wait for another second. I ran. I didn't even bother waking Ben. I grabbed my bag, slammed the front door open, and sprinted into the woods. I heard him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I never looked back. The next morning, I drove back home. Ben was confused when he woke up and saw I was gone, but I didn't tell him everything. I don't think he'd believe me if I did. But I can't shake what I found in that crawl space. The photos. The notes. Earl's face. The people who didn't leave. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I won't. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. I don't ever want to find out. It started a week ago, but I still can't get the images out of my head. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I had surgery. Nothing too serious, just a routine procedure, but it left me needing a few days of recovery at the hospital. My doctor assured me that everything would be fine. It wasn't a big hospital, not the kind you see in the city, but one of those smaller ones that's out in the country, more isolated. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the staff are familiar with every patient that walks through the door. I wasn't worried. After the surgery, I was groggy, mostly asleep, and I didn't notice much. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and I realized something was off. My room felt different. The lights were dim, but the place felt too quiet. Too still. At first, I thought maybe it was just the after effects of the anesthesia, but as I looked around, I realized something wasn't right. There was someone sitting at the far side of the room, near the window, just staring at me. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see the shape of a person hunched over, their face in shadows. My heart raced, and I tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery shot through my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the person didn't answer. They just sat there, motionless. My throat was dry, and I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I thought maybe it was a nurse or someone from the hospital just checking in on me, but the silence was unnerving. After a few moments, the person shifted slightly. I could make out the faint outline of handcuffs on their wrists. That's when the panic set in. I was alone with someone who had been restrained. That's when I heard a faint shuffle and the jangle of metal. I tried to call out again, but nothing came out. My throat was too dry. I could barely move, still recovering from the surgery, and now my mind was racing with questions. Why was someone in handcuffs here? Why hadn't anyone told me about this? The person moved slightly. I could feel my heart in my throat as I watched the shadows. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear the faint clink of metal every time they shifted in their seat. I needed help. I needed to get out of there. My instinct was to press the nurse call button, but when I reached for it, I realized the cord had been cut. That's when I started to panic. I tried to look around the room, my vision still blurry from the meds, but the silence was suffocating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door to my room, which was supposed to be locked for safety, was ajar. And that's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps approaching. My blood ran cold. I tried to force myself to stand, but the pain from my stitches was too much. Every movement felt like my body was on fire. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound that would indicate help was near. The footsteps stopped. The person at the window was still, but I could sense their attention shifting. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, but I couldn't make myself look directly at them. My breath was shallow now, and I realized the situation was far worse than I had initially thought. Whoever this was, this person locked up and sitting in my hospital room wasn't supposed to be here. That's when I heard the voice, low and gravelly. It was like a whisper, but it carried enough to send a chill down my spine. "Stay quiet," the voice said, barely above a whisper. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to call for help, but I knew it would be useless. There was no one coming. I was alone. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The silence was unbearable. My only focus was the handcuffs, the metallic sound, the person in my room. My thoughts raced through possibilities, none of them good. Then it happened. The lights went out. The whole hospital went dark, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat and the distant hum of the emergency generator kicking in. The power failure was brief, just long enough to leave the entire building in pitch black darkness. It was enough to make everything seem even more sinister. I could hear the person standing up now, moving in the dark, footsteps coming closer. I felt my entire body freeze in terror. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the floor reached my ears, and the person moved closer. "Stay down," they whispered again, this time with a little more force. I barely had time to react before the door to my room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. Someone entered, loud, deliberate footsteps. It was one of the police officers, and I couldn't tell whether they were here to help or if they were part of what was going on. "Is everything okay in here?" the officer asked, voice heavy with suspicion, but he didn't come into the room. The person in the shadows, the one in handcuffs, spoke again, their voice shaking slightly now. "Get me out of here," they demanded, not in a whisper this time. Their voice was more commanding, urgent. "I can't do that," the officer responded, his tone firm but unsure. "You're not going anywhere." For a moment, the room was still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward. There was a scuffle. The sound of metal clanging, followed by a scream. I couldn't see anything. I was paralyzed, trapped in the bed, too terrified to move. I heard the officer shout, then a gunshot. The crack of it echoed through the room, but the silence that followed was worse than anything. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't see anything. My mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The officer came in finally, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I saw him kneeling beside me. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. I was moved quickly after that, taken to another room. The doctor came in to check on me, but I was still too disoriented to make sense of it all. Later, I learned the full story. The person who had been in my room wasn't just any criminal. They were violent, dangerous, and had been caught on charges I didn't want to know. The officer had been keeping them in my room by mistake. They'd been placed in the wrong ward. The power outage had been the perfect opportunity for them to escape, except they didn't expect the officer to intervene. But by then, it was too late for me. I couldn't erase the memory of that night, the feeling of being trapped in a room with someone who should never have been there. It took weeks for me to feel safe again. And I still don't trust hospitals. The whole thing still feels unreal. But it happened, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. I didn't think much of it when the company announced a mandatory team-building retreat in the middle of nowhere. It seemed harmless enough, just an overnight trip in the woods with some silly exercises to boost morale and all that. Everyone in my office had been grumbling about it for weeks. There were rumors that some of the activities were a little too intense for some people, but honestly, I didn't care much. I was just there to get it over with and hopefully make it back home without too much hassle. The first day was mostly the usual stuff: trust falls, obstacle courses, things that made everyone roll their eyes but also made us laugh a little. But there was a tension in the air the whole time, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the fact that most of us didn't really like each other, or maybe it was just being stuck in the middle of nowhere with no cell service for hours. Whatever it was there. By the time the sun started setting, we'd wrapped up for the day, and we were all gathering around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and talking. But then the air changed. The woods went quiet. The chirping of the crickets stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I looked around, confused. It was too quiet, and I realized that everyone else had noticed it too. One of the team leaders, Dan, was trying to keep the conversation going, talking about some ridiculous inside joke from a meeting we had weeks ago, but his voice didn't quite mask the nervous tension in the group. Everyone kept looking around, as if waiting for something. That's when I saw him. A man standing just at the edge of the camp, hidden between the trees, his eyes glowing faintly in the dying light. I didn't recognize him at first, but then my stomach dropped. It was Craig. Craig was a former employee who had left the company 6 months ago under bad circumstances. He'd been fired for being a bit too much of a loose cannon, and after that, we heard that he'd become pretty angry with the company. I hadn't seen him since then, and I never expected to see him again. Especially not here. Before anyone could react, Craig stepped forward, holding something in his hand, a gun. It was aimed at the ground, but the sight of it was enough to send a cold wave of fear through the group. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and rough. I froze, unable to process what was happening. I thought maybe it was some kind of sick joke, but the way his eyes were wild, it was clear this was no prank. Craig's gaze shifted, and suddenly, he pointed the gun at Dan, the leader, who had been talking just a second ago. Dan didn't even get a chance to raise his hands before Craig's voice rang out again. "Get away from the fire. All of you, get away." We all stumbled to our feet, instinctively backing away from the fire. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear making my hands shake. I looked around for anyone who could do something, anything, to stop this, but no one seemed to be moving. We were all paralyzed by the shock of it. Craig paced in front of us, his eyes darting between each of us like a predator deciding which of its prey to go after first. I noticed that his hand, which had been gripping the gun, was shaking. But the anger in his eyes made me feel even more terrified. He didn't look like a man who was scared, he looked like someone who had nothing to lose. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. It was all I could muster. Craig's head snapped toward me. "Because you all think you can just forget about what you did to me. Fired me. Treated me like I was nothing." His words were jagged, full of venom. It was like he'd rehearsed them 1,000 times, but hearing them out loud made the air feel even heavier. "Craig, just put the gun down," Dan said, his voice shaky but firm. "Let's talk about this." But Craig wasn't listening. He was too far gone, his rage taking control of him. And then, just like that, he lunged toward Dan. The gun went off. The shot rang in my ears, and for a second, I couldn't hear anything else. Dan dropped to the ground, his face pale, his body crumpling like a rag doll. Screams filled the air. The rest of us scattered. I don't even know how I moved, but I found myself sprinting into the woods, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs burning from the effort. I didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps, fast, heavy, was right behind me. He was following. I knew I couldn't outrun him. The woods were dense, and the terrain was unfamiliar. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I kept running, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could find some kind of shelter. A building. A car. Anything. I stumbled upon a small creek, its water gurgling quietly. Without thinking, I crouched down and splashed my face, trying to steady myself. I couldn't hear Craig anymore, but I knew he was close. I could feel it. Just as I started to catch my breath, I saw him. His face was twisted, his eyes wide with rage, his gun hanging loosely in his hand. He was looking around, searching for me. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to think, too scared to move. All I could do was hope he wouldn't find me. But he did. His voice rang out from behind me. "You can't hide. I'll find you." I scrambled to my feet, but before I could run, Craig lunged at me, grabbing my arm and yanking me backwards. I gasped, trying to break free, but his grip was too strong. "Please, Craig," I begged, "just let me go. No one has to get hurt." But he wasn't listening. The rage in his eyes was all-consuming. He pulled me back toward the camp, dragging me like I was nothing. I don't know how long I was out there, fighting to escape, but eventually, sirens blared in the distance. The sound of approaching police cars, flashing lights illuminating the trees. Craig froze, his grip loosening. In that moment, I don't know what made him snap out of it, but I didn't wait to find out. I broke free, running as fast as I could until I reached the police officers who had arrived on the scene. They took Craig away. I don't know where he went after that, but I never saw him again. The retreat was canceled. The company offered no apology. And Dan, he didn't make it. But I made it out. Barely. I never wanted to go camping again. Never wanted to trust that things would be okay. And in a way, I think I'll always hear those footsteps behind me. It was supposed to be a fun road trip. My wife, Rachel, and I had been planning this for months. We were taking the kids Olivia, who's 9, and Ethan, who's 12, on a week-long trip across the state. The plan was simple: drive through a few small towns, hit some parks, and just enjoy the time away. Everything was going smoothly until it wasn't. We were about 4 hours into the trip when Rachel, who was driving, suggested we take a scenic route off the highway. The GPS was showing a back road that cut through some woods and farmland. I thought it sounded nice. It'd give us a break from the monotonous highway and might make for some good photos. Besides, we had plenty of time. We took the turn and started down the narrow road. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars, no houses, just endless stretches of trees. As we drove on, I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees grew thick on either side of the road, and there was a stillness in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. It didn't help that the sun was starting to set. The road twisted and turned, getting narrower the farther we went. My daughter Olivia started to complain that it was getting dark, and even Ethan seemed to be getting restless in the back seat. I figured it would just be a few more miles, so I told Rachel to keep going, but my gut told me something wasn't right. There was a nagging feeling that maybe we had gone too far. "Hey, do you think we should turn back?" I asked Rachel, trying to sound casual. "I think we're fine," she said, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "We'll just check the map again. I'll find us a spot to turn around soon." That's when we saw it. A small town. It wasn't on the GPS, and I didn't remember passing any signs. But there it was, right at the end of the road. A place that looked like it belonged in the past. The buildings were old, run down, some with broken windows and boarded up doors. The streetlights flickered as we drove through the empty main street. There wasn't a soul in sight. Rachel slowed the car to a crawl. I noticed an old gas station on the corner, the kind you see in movies, and a diner with its lights still on. But there was no one around. No cars. No people. Just the eerie quiet. "This doesn't feel right," I said, more to myself than to Rachel. "Maybe we should ask someone for directions," Rachel suggested. She sounded just as uncomfortable as I felt. We pulled into the gas station. The place was small, dusty, and the pumps looked ancient. I got out and walked over to the attendant, a middle-aged man who was sitting behind the counter, staring at a small TV. He didn't even look up as I approached. "Hey, we're a little lost." We took a wrong turn, and we were wondering how to get back to the main road. The man slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were dull, almost lifeless. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. I laughed nervously. "I'm sorry. I didn't catch that. You shouldn't be here, he repeated, his voice low, almost threatening. I glanced back at the car, where Rachel and the kids were waiting. We're just passing through, I said, trying to keep the situation light. Don't stay long, the man said. He finally stood up, walking slowly towards the back of the station without another word. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the building. I was starting to get a bad feeling about this place. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it wasn't right. I went back to the car quickly. Rachel, we need to go. Now. Rachel frowned. What happened? Just get us out of here, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. This place is off. We didn't drive more than a couple hundred yards before we saw the first person. A man, standing on the side of the road. He was tall, thin, and wearing an old, tattered jacket. His face was pale, with hollow cheeks, and he was staring directly at us as we passed. I didn't make eye contact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. That was weird, Rachel muttered under her breath. What do you think that guy was about? I don't know, but I don't want to find out, I said, looking back at the man in the rearview mirror. I think we should just turn around. We turned around, but by the time we reached the spot where we entered the town, there was another man standing in the road, blocking our path. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us with a cold, calculating look. Rachel slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop a few feet from him. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at the car. Get out of the way. I shouted through the windshield, my pulse quickening. We need to leave. The man didn't move. My heart was pounding now. I didn't know what these people were doing here, but they weren't making any effort to help us. They were just watching us like we were prey. Rachel backed the car up, turning in the opposite direction, but before we could go far, another man appeared, this one much closer. He was leaning against a lamppost, casually smoking a cigarette. Do you have a problem? I yelled at him, my voice shaking. We don't want any trouble. We just need to leave. The man took a long drag of his cigarette and threw it on the ground. He slowly straightened up and took a step toward the car. You're not going anywhere, he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a conversation. Rachel, go! Now! I shouted. Rachel hit the gas pedal, and we sped away, tires screeching as we turned down the narrow road. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men following us. We didn't stop until we were back on the main highway, far away from that strange town. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. The rest of the trip was quiet. Too quiet. We never talked about what happened. But we all knew. We were lucky to get out of there in one piece. And I swear, to this day, I can still see those faces in the rearview mirror, watching us as we drove away. It started as just a way to clear my head. I had a long day, and the rain was light enough to make running feel refreshing. I liked the sound of it, the way it drowned out everything else. The trail I usually took was quieter in weather like this, and I thought I'd have it all to myself. The park was mostly empty when I arrived. I remember seeing only one other car in the lot, an old sedan with muddy tires. I didn't think much of it. People came and went, and it wasn't unusual for someone to leave their car there overnight. The path was slick, but I didn't mind. It was one of those nights where everything felt calm, even with the rain picking up. The trees bent low, heavy with water, and the lights along the trail barely cut through the dark. I ran slower than usual, careful on the wet pavement. I'd gone about a mile in when it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of mud that had washed onto the path, and I went down hard. My ankle twisted under me, and the pain was sharp and immediate. I sat there, clutching it, feeling the cold seep through my leggings. The rain wasn't refreshing anymore. It was soaking through my jacket and making me shiver. I tried to stand, but my ankle buckled. It wasn't broken, but I couldn't put weight on it. My phone was back in the car. I hadn't thought I'd need it for a short run. I felt stupid and helpless sitting there in the rain. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought I'd imagined them, but they got louder, closer. A man came around the bend, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. He slowed when he saw me, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I think I twisted my ankle," I said. "I can't walk on it." He didn't respond right away, just stood there looking at me. His hood shadowed most of his face, but I could see his mouth, a thin line, not smiling. "Need help?" he asked after a long pause. "Yeah," I said, relief flooding through me. "If you could help me back to the parking lot, I'd really appreciate it." He didn't move. "No one else out here," he said, more to himself than to me. Bad night to be running. I didn't like the way he said it. There was no warmth in his tone, no concern. Just an observation, flat and detached. "I didn't think it'd get this bad," I said, trying to keep the conversation normal. "The rain, I mean." He stepped closer, and I instinctively leaned back. He crouched down, his face level with mine now. His eyes were dark, and there was something in them that made my stomach twist. He wasn't looking at my ankle. He was looking at me. "You're hurt pretty bad," he said, his voice quieter now. "Can't go anywhere like that." "I just need to get to my car," I said, my voice a little unsteady. "It's not far." He reached out suddenly, grabbing my ankle. I flinched, the pain shooting up my leg. "Doesn't look broken," he said, as if I hadn't already figured that out. His grip was too tight, and his fingers felt cold even through my wet clothes. "I'm fine," I said, pulling my leg away. "I just need help walking." He stood up, towering over me now. "I could carry you," he said, like it was the most logical thing in the world. "No, that's okay," I said quickly. "If you could just let me lean on you, that'd be enough." He didn't move. He was staring at me again, and I realized he hadn't blinked the whole time. The rain dripped from his hood, sliding down his face. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "Not safe." Something about the way he said it felt wrong, like he wasn't talking about the weather or the trail. My heart was pounding now, the cold and the rain forgotten. I tried to push myself up, but my ankle gave out again, and I fell back with a gasp. "Stay still," he said sharply. "You'll hurt yourself more." I didn't like the way he said it, like he was scolding me. I didn't like anything about him. I forced a smile, trying to keep things calm. "Thanks for stopping," I said, my voice shaking. "But I think I'll just wait here until someone else comes by." "No one else is coming," he said, almost casually. "Not this late." My stomach dropped. I hadn't even thought about the time. It was past 9, and the park closed at 10. He was probably right. No one else would be out here in this weather. He crouched down again, closer this time. "Let me help you," he said, his tone softer now. "You'll catch your death sitting here." Something in me snapped. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever he had planned. I grabbed a branch that had fallen nearby and held it up, the bark rough against my hands. "Stay back," I said, my voice firm. He didn't flinch. If anything, He seemed amused. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked, tilting his head. I didn't answer. My hands were trembling, but I kept the branch between us. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind cutting through my wet clothes. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, standing up again. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need your help," I said, edging back toward the trees. "Just leave me alone." He took a step forward, and I swung the branch, missing by inches. "Hey," he snapped, his voice angry now. "What's your problem?" I didn't wait for him to close the distance. I pushed myself up, leaning on the trees for support, and started limping away as fast as I could. My ankle screamed with every step, but I didn't care. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps faster than mine. "Come back," he shouted. "You're gonna get yourself killed out here." I didn't look back. The parking lot wasn't far. If I could just make it there, maybe someone would be pulling in or leaving. The path curved, and I lost sight of him for a moment. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in gasps. When I reached the lot, it was empty except for my car and the old sedan I'd seen earlier. My car was too far to make it, but the sedan was close. I ran to it, banging on the window. "Help. Please." The door opened, and an older woman leaned out, her eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "There's a man," I said, barely able to get the words out. "He's following me." She didn't hesitate. She opened the passenger door and helped me inside, locking it behind me. We watched the path together, but he never came out. I don't know if he gave up or if he was hiding, waiting for the next person to come along. The woman drove me to a nearby gas station, where I called for help. The police searched the park but didn't find anyone. They said it was probably just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. It all started when we won that free weekend getaway at the remote resort. I know, it sounds too good to be true, right? We didn't think much of it at the time, and the email seemed legitimate. The resort was supposed to be this exclusive, private place tucked away in the mountains, and the offer said it was a special promotion for a lucky couple. My girlfriend and I were both working long hours, and the idea of getting away for a few days in a peaceful place sounded perfect. When we arrived, the place looked just like in the pictures, impressive, with wooden cabins, a scenic lake, and mountains in the distance. Everything was beautiful, but there was something off about it from the beginning. The place was completely isolated. No other cars around, no other guests. Not even any staff that we could see. But there was a sign at the entrance that said "Welcome," our names, with a big, bold arrow pointing toward the main cabin. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. I assumed it was part of the charm, remote, private, exclusive. The kind of place you'd only see in movies, where everything seems a bit too perfect. We followed the path up to the main cabin, and that's when we met them, Brian and Lisa, the couple who ran the resort. They were waiting outside the door, smiling like they had been expecting us. Brian was tall, with dark hair and a friendly face. Lisa was shorter, with short blonde hair and a warm smile. They looked like they were in their early 40s, maybe late 30s. They greeted us like we were long-lost friends, introducing themselves and telling us they were the owners. Brian told us how they'd been running the resort for years, and how they like to keep things private and personal for their guests. Lisa was all smiles, offering us drinks and snacks as soon as we stepped inside. It felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. They showed us to our cabin, just a short walk from the main one. The cabin was nice, but again, a little too perfect. Everything was pristine, as if no one had ever stayed there before. The bed was made up, the towels were folded perfectly, and the windows had an almost unnatural shine to them. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see if you were on a relaxing retreat. It felt more like a showroom. We decided to take a walk around, get some fresh air. The surroundings were beautiful, no doubt about that, but it felt eerily quiet. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. We spent a good hour walking around, exploring the lake and some trails that led into the woods. It was peaceful, but not in the comfortable way I had hoped for. It was almost as if the silence was too loud, suffocating. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was nearing evening. We were supposed to have dinner with Brian and Lisa at the main cabin, but I started to feel uneasy. There was something about the way they looked at us. They were too welcoming, too eager to please. It felt staged, rehearsed, like they had done this before with other couples, except there weren't any other guests here. We walked back to the main cabin for dinner. When we arrived, Brian and Lisa were already seated at the dining table. They had set out a beautiful spread: steaks, vegetables, mashed potatoes, wine. It was enough food to feed 6 people, but there were only the 4 of us. The conversation during dinner was awkward. Brian and Lisa kept talking about how they loved having guests, how they were so lucky to have us there. But every time I looked at them, I could see a hint of something behind their smiles. Their eyes, especially Brian's, seemed too intense, like he was studying us, trying to figure us out. Lisa kept laughing, almost too much, at every little joke we made. I started to wonder if they were trying to keep us entertained, like they were afraid of something happening if we stopped talking. After dinner, they suggested we go for a nightcap in the lounge area. I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. My gut was telling me to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. I just hoped that once the night was over, I could go back to our cabin and forget about the weirdness. As we sat in the lounge, Lisa started talking more about the resort. She mentioned how it was a special place, and that they had a very small group of guests every year. That was when I noticed that neither of them had mentioned any other guests or staff. When I asked about it, Brian smiled and said, "We prefer to keep things private. It's just you two this weekend. We like to give our guests an experience they can't get anywhere else." At that moment, I realized that they were the only people here. That's when the feeling of unease turned into something more solid. Something wasn't right. I started to wonder if we were the only ones to ever win this free getaway, and if that was even true in the first place. The idea that we might be the only people they had in a long time made me feel trapped, like we were in a place where nobody could help us if something went wrong. The conversation turned dark when Brian began talking about the history of the area. He mentioned how the resort had been passed down through generations, and how not everyone makes it out of here. At first, I thought he was just joking, but there was no humor in his voice. His eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, waiting for a reaction. Lisa didn't say anything. She just stared at her wine glass, swirling it slowly. I tried to laugh it off, but the air in the room suddenly felt thick. I wanted to leave, but it wasn't as easy as just walking out. I didn't trust the way Brian was looking at us, or the way Lisa's smile had turned into something too wide, too calculated. I realized that we hadn't even been shown the resort's other cabins, or the amenities. It was almost as if they didn't want us to see anything beyond this one place, this one room. The night dragged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The longer we stayed, the more I felt like they were watching us, waiting for us to slip up, to do something they expected. I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point, Brian and Lisa stood up, and without saying a word, walked toward the door. It was as if they had planned this for weeks, like they had been waiting for us to make the first move. As soon as they left, I turned to my girlfriend and whispered, "We need to get out of here." Now! We grabbed our things and ran for the door, but when we reached the cabin entrance, it wouldn't open. The lock had been changed. We were trapped. I banged on the door, shouted for help, but the silence outside was deafening. There was no answer. Suddenly, the lights went out, and everything went pitch black. We could hear footsteps in the distance, echoing in the hall. I don't know how we managed it, but somehow we got out. We found a hidden side door and ran into the woods, not stopping until we found the main road hours later. I don't remember much after that. I was too scared to think straight. We called the police once we got back to the city, but by the time they arrived, the resort was gone. Completely empty, like it had never been there. Brian and Lisa were never found. The authorities said there had been no records of the resort even existing. To this day, I don't know what they planned, but I'm just glad we got out when we did. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a two-car garage. A couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, a couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. Maybe they forgot about the appointment. Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. Neither am I replied, but I wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. I think we should check it out. What? Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. I don't know, I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but I'm not going first. We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us, or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic. Almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. We need to leave now, I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope you'd use to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. This is all wrong, I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. We need to call the police. This place it's a trap. As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. We need to get out of here, now, I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone, but the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. What the hell? The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of the house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about that house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap, or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure, we were lucky to get out of there alive. I was driving home that night from a late meeting. It had been raining hard for hours, The kind of rain that makes it feel like you're driving through a sheet of water. The road was slick, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I wasn't far from the exit to my neighborhood, just a quiet stretch of highway I knew well. Not much happened out there at night. It was mostly empty except for the occasional car, but tonight it seemed quieter than usual. I had just passed the old gas station when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another car pulled over to the side, waiting for the rain to pass. But then I saw the hazard lights flashing. No one was around, and the car was in a weird position, almost like it had been abandoned. I couldn't tell from a distance whether it was just someone waiting for help, but something about the situation made me uneasy. There was no reason for a car to be stopped in the middle of nowhere in the rain, especially with those hazard lights on, blinking in the storm. I slowed down, rolling the window down a little, trying to get a better look. No other cars were in sight, and the road was so empty that the sight of a single car with its lights flashing stood out like a sore thumb. I couldn't just keep driving by without checking. The rational part of me told me I should call the police, but I figured if someone needed help, I should at least see what was going on. I pulled over a few feet behind the car, the tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. It was a mid-sized sedan, an older model, its rear bumper dented. I couldn't see any signs of what might have happened, but it was just too odd, sitting there, lights on, engine off, like someone had left it in a hurry. I got out of my car, keeping an eye on the road. No cars in sight, just the rain pouring down. The car I was walking toward had its driver's side door wide open. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, listening to the soft thrum of the rain against the pavement. The rain was so heavy that I barely heard anything else, but there was something about the scene that felt wrong, too quiet. The door was still ajar when I reached it. I leaned in and looked inside. That's when I saw it. The seat was soaked, but not from the rain. The car was a mess, papers scattered on the floor, and the driver's seat was turned awkwardly to the side. The first thing I noticed was the blood. It wasn't a lot, but there were smears on the seat, on the steering wheel, and on the door. It looked like someone had been dragged out of the car, or maybe forced into it. The blood wasn't fresh, but it was still visible enough that I could tell something violent had happened. My stomach turned, and I took a step back, unsure of what I should do next. I looked around. The rain was coming down in sheets, and it felt like I was the only one around. No one else had stopped, and the road was empty. I glanced back into the car, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was a bag on the passenger seat, just sitting there, like the owner had dropped it in a hurry. I don't know why, but I reached inside the car and pulled the bag out. It felt wrong touching someone else's stuff like that, but I couldn't help myself. Maybe I thought there was something inside that would explain what had happened, some sign that could make sense of all this. I unzipped it slowly, my hands shaking more than I expected, and found a wallet, a few personal items, and a phone. The phone had a cracked screen, but when I turned it over, the first thing I noticed was a message on the screen, one of those text notifications that didn't require unlocking. The message was simple: get to the car. Now! It was sent about 15 minutes ago. My blood ran cold. The phone wasn't recent, it had been sitting there for a while. But the message was fresh. Who was it for? I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been here recently. But where were they now? And what had happened to them? I glanced around, my mind racing. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft at first, but then louder. Footsteps. I froze, turning my head slowly. My heart hammered in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Someone else was out there. I didn't wait around to find out who. I shoved the bag back inside the car, my pulse racing. I started to back away, my eyes darting around the dark, wet landscape. The rain felt colder now, as if the air had suddenly dropped several degrees. I rushed to my car, almost slipping in the rain as I got back inside. I locked the door before I even turned the engine on, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. I looked through the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I didn't see anything at first. No one was following me, but I didn't feel safe. My heart was still racing. My mind kept going back to the blood, the message on the phone, the odd feeling of being watched. I drove off quickly, my tires skidding slightly as I accelerated, trying to leave the scene behind me. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The blood in the car. The phone. The message. I drove for what felt like forever before I finally pulled over at a gas station, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I tried to catch my breath, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about the car, the blood, the message. What had really happened there? Who was hurt? And where were they now? I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? I hadn't seen anything that could help them. No one else was around. There was no sign of a struggle outside the car, just the blood inside. I didn't have answers, and that scared me even more. I didn't know what was happening, and the longer I stayed in that spot, the more I felt like I was part of something I didn't understand. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever happened, it wasn't over. I wasn't sure if it would be for me or someone else next, but the whole experience left me with a deep sense of unease. Something bad had happened out there, and I was far from the only one affected. It was one of those nights where the rain never really stops. The kind of storm that makes the streets look like rivers, and the wind howls loud enough to drown out everything else. I had been walking home from my shift at work, soaked through despite the umbrella, and I was so ready to be inside, away from the weather. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare, not bothering to check which car it was. I just wanted to get home. I watched the little map on my phone, waiting for the car to pull up. I wasn't far from the usual spot where I'd get picked up, and I saw the pin slowly move closer, the car approaching. As it got near, I stepped to the curb and looked up. A black sedan was coming down the road, slowing down. I stepped forward, glad the wait was almost over. When the car stopped in front of me, the window rolled down, and the driver looked out. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with dark hair and a beard. His face was tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. I didn't think much of it. I got in the back seat, thanked him, and told him where I was headed. I just wanted to get home, have some tea, and relax. The last thing on my mind was that something was wrong. The driver didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, and then he started driving. The route on my app didn't seem right, though. We weren't heading in the direction I expected. I had been in this part of town enough to know the main roads, and I could tell we were heading south when I should have been going north. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're going the wrong way." He didn't say anything at first. Just kept driving. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was new to the area. I tried again. "I need to go to Maple Street, not South Boulevard." "You've missed the turn." He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, and I caught the briefest glimpse of something strange in his eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something else. Something colder. But then he spoke. "It's a shortcut," he said, his voice flat, like he was explaining something simple. "Don't worry. You'll get there." I didn't believe him. I checked my phone again. The little pin on the map was still moving in the wrong direction. We weren't heading toward Maple Street. The more I stared at the screen, the more I realized we were going farther away from where I needed to be. "Are you sure about this?" I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "I really need to go that way." I pointed to the north, trying to be calm, but I felt a rising sense of panic. The driver didn't reply. Instead, he just turned the corner and accelerated. The streets were empty, and the rain continued to fall, hammering against the car's roof. I tried not to think too much about the fact that we were now on streets I didn't recognize. "Hey, can you stop the car?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "I need to get out." He still didn't respond. He didn't even glance at me in the mirror this time. I began to feel the weight of the silence in the car. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was thickening. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the windshield and the hum of the engine, but it all felt distant. I was alone in this car with him, and it was getting harder to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what was happening. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This felt deliberate. I needed to get out. I needed to get home. "Stop the car," I demanded, louder this time, my voice trembling. "I'm not going any farther with you. Stop the car, now." Finally, he glanced at me in the mirror. He didn't smile. He didn't look worried. He just looked tired, as if he had been waiting for me to say something for a long time. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice low and calm, like he was trying to reassure me. But I could hear something in it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold. And it didn't sound like he was trying to comfort me. It sounded like a command. "I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Pull over. Let me out." But he didn't. The car kept moving. The streets around us were getting more desolate. The houses were spaced farther apart, and I couldn't even see streetlights now, just the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. My mind was racing. I reached for my phone again, hands shaking, and I tried to send a message to a friend. My hands were so wet that I could barely type, but I managed to send the message. "Something's wrong. The driver is going the wrong way. Please call the cops if I don't respond." It felt like forever before I saw him glance in the mirror again. This time, his eyes lingered longer, and I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. He wasn't taking me to my destination. He was taking me somewhere else. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice betrayed me, breaking as I spoke. "Relax," he said again, his voice like a slow drawl. "You're going to be fine. We're almost there." I had no idea where there was, but I wasn't about to find out. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and tried the door. It was locked. I tried to press the button to open the door from the inside, but it didn't work. He had locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the car, desperate for something, anything to help. I had to get out. I reached for the handle again, this time pulling with everything I had. The door clicked, and I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, yanked it wide, and as the car slowed for a turn, I threw myself out of it. I hit the wet pavement hard, my knees scraping against the ground as I scrambled to my feet. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I didn't look back. I just ran. My shoes were soaked, my legs screaming, but I didn't care. I ran and ran, not stopping until I found a house with lights on. I knocked frantically, and someone finally answered. A woman in her pajamas, clearly startled. I couldn't even explain myself properly. I was so shaken. but she took one look at me and called the police. The cops came. I don't know what they did with the driver, but I know I never saw him again. They didn't find him that night, not in the places I thought he might have gone. They said it was likely he just picked someone up for whatever reason and got scared when I tried to leave. Maybe he was trying to get away with something. I don't know. The ride was supposed to be the end of my shift, the end of a tiring night. But it turned into something else. Something I won't forget. That driver, he wasn't just lost. He knew exactly where he was going. And I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't take ride sharing anymore. Not after that night. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. I'd been planning it for weeks, carefully picking a trail I knew wasn't too crowded but still had enough markers that I wouldn't get lost. I packed everything I needed: food, gear, and my water reservoir, which I triple-checked before leaving. The hike out to the campsite was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp. I didn't see another person the whole way, and for once, I didn't mind. It was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. I reached the spot I'd picked out a little before sunset, a flat clearing near a small stream. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside watching the stars come out. When the temperature dropped, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I felt ready to tackle the hike back. I packed up camp quickly, not wanting to waste daylight. I took a sip from my water reservoir before zipping it into my pack, and everything seemed fine. The stream nearby was clear, so I refilled my backup bottle just in case and started on the trail. It wasn't until late morning that I noticed something was wrong. I stopped to take a drink and realized the water tasted off. At first, I thought maybe it was the plastic from the reservoir, but I'd never had that problem before. I took another sip, and this time, the taste was stronger, almost metallic. I stopped walking and took the reservoir out of my pack to inspect it. The water looked fine, but the smell hit me as soon as I opened it. It was chemical, sharp, like something you'd use to clean a bathroom. I dumped it out immediately, my heart pounding. I didn't understand. I'd filled the reservoir that morning from the same stream I'd used the night before, and I'd used a filter both times. I checked my backup bottle, and that's when the panic really set in. The water in the bottle had the same smell. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from the trailhead, and the sun was getting higher. It was hot, and I'd already been hiking for a couple of hours. I'd planned my water carefully, and now I didn't have any that was safe to drink. I thought about turning back to the stream near the campsite, but the idea made me nervous. What if there was something in the water there? Or worse, what if someone was there? The thought came out of nowhere, but once I had it, I couldn't shake it. I tried to push it away. Who would do something like this? But the reservoir and bottle were fine the night before. I was sure of it. I decided to keep going. The trail was supposed to follow another stream a few miles ahead, and I figured I'd try again there. The hike felt different now. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the second stream, I was sweating and lightheaded. I crouched by the water, my filter in hand, but I hesitated. The water looked fine, but what if it wasn't? What if the problem wasn't the water at all? I forced myself to filter some and took a small sip. It tasted normal, but I couldn't bring myself to drink more. The memory of the smell from my reservoir was still too strong. I filled my backup bottle and packed it away, deciding I'd only drink if I absolutely had to. I kept walking, trying to focus on the trail ahead and not the growing sense of dread in my chest. The trail started to climb, winding up a steep hill. I was struggling by then, my legs shaking from dehydration. I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. At the top of the hill, where the trail curved, there was a pile of rocks stacked in a way that wasn't natural. It was small, maybe a foot tall, but it stood out. I froze, staring at it. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Slowly, I walked closer. My mouth was dry, and not just from the lack of water. When I reached the rocks, I saw something sticking out from between them. A piece of paper, folded and tucked into the pile. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before pulling it out. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could still read the writing. Not safe. That was all it said. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, looking around wildly. The forest was silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I felt exposed, like whoever had left the note was watching me. My mind raced. Did they mean the water wasn't safe? Or was it something else? I didn't wait to find out. I started moving, faster now, even though my legs felt like they were going to give out. I don't know how long I walked like that, my head spinning and my throat burning. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was barely holding it together. My car was the only one in the parking lot, just as it had been when I'd arrived. I climbed in and locked the doors, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the note or the water. I still don't know what happened out there, or who tampered with my supplies. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the woods since. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies of water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we'd found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it. We were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark. I don't even know where to begin. I've been trying to tell myself it was nothing, just some weird misunderstanding, but I can't shake it. Not after what happened. It started out so normal. We were camping, just the two of us, my girlfriend, Emma, and me. We had picked out a spot deep in the woods, far away from the crowds. We wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. The first day went well. We set up our tent by a small creek, started a fire, and just relaxed. It was a beautiful spot, nothing out of the ordinary. No strange feelings, no weird vibes. Just the two of us talking and laughing, enjoying the evening. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. It started with them. A group of campers. We hadn't seen them before, but around dusk, they appeared by the fire. They seemed friendly enough, two guys and a woman walking along the trail not far from our site. At first, we barely noticed them, but one of them called out, asking if we wanted to join them for a drink. We had nothing planned for the evening, so we figured, why not? We walked over to their camp, and they were sitting around a fire, the flames casting long shadows in the trees. They had a couple of beers, a bottle of whiskey, and a few snacks. It seemed normal enough. We introduced ourselves, and they were nice. Not overly friendly, but polite. We all started talking, mostly about where we were from and how we ended up here. I'll admit, the conversation was a little awkward at first, but after a few drinks, it loosened up. It was just casual chatter at first, nothing strange. They told us they had been camping in the area for a while, moving from place to place, exploring different parts of the woods. They said they liked the solitude, and I could see that. It wasn't a surprise that they'd come up here to get away from it all. The woman, her name was Claire, was nice enough. But there was something about her smile that felt a little too sharp, a little too knowing. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was nothing, but I kept getting this feeling that she was watching me just a bit too closely. Every time I glance over at her, she'd be looking right at me, and when our eyes met, she'd smile. It didn't feel threatening, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about it. As the night wore on, the mood seemed to shift. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The guys started making more jokes, laughing a bit too loud, and Claire seemed to get quieter, just watching. I remember trying to keep the conversation going, but it felt like I was the only one still trying. Emma had already finished her drink and looked a little tired, like she was ready to head back to our camp. I felt the same, honestly. The night had stretched on longer than we planned. So, we told them we were going to head back. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was subtle. One of the guys, Dave, I think his name was, stood up and clapped me on the shoulder, laughing. "You guys aren't going anywhere," he said, too loudly. "The night's still young. Come on, stay for a bit." I chuckled awkwardly, not really feeling like staying. "We're pretty tired," I said, trying to keep it light. "Maybe another time." But then Claire spoke. "You don't want to go yet," she said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't threatening, but it had a kind of cold edge to it, like she wasn't asking anymore. "The night's beautiful. You won't find peace like this anywhere else. Just stay a little longer." I felt this sudden pressure, like they were all looking at us, waiting for an answer. Emma looked at me, and I could tell she was uncomfortable too, but she didn't want to make a scene. She nodded, giving a forced smile. "Maybe just a little longer," she said. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't sit right. The way they were staring at us made me feel like we didn't really have a choice. I tried to shake it off, but I could feel the tension building. It was like they were waiting for us to stay, to make us stay. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew we needed to get back. Emma had already started to gather her things. I stood up, ready to go, but Dave was standing just a little too close, blocking the path. "You don't need to go," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost too calm. "We've got a few more drinks. Just relax." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't right. I tried to step around him, but he didn't move. It was like he was deliberately keeping me there, like they were all trying to keep us from leaving. "We really have to go," I said, my voice a little more firm now. "We've got stuff to do tomorrow." Claire stood up and took a step closer. "You'll be fine," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's not safe to walk back through the woods at night. Stay here. We'll keep you safe." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said it, like there was no other option. I felt trapped, like if I didn't go along with it, something worse might happen. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder to hide how uneasy I felt. I looked over at Emma, who seemed equally uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I could see her trying to make up her mind, her eyes darting around the camp, looking for an excuse, an out. "Look, we really appreciate it," Emma said, standing up and reaching for my hand. "But we're just going to go back. It's getting late." There was a long pause. I could feel their eyes on us, like they were waiting for us to say the right thing. Then, suddenly, Dave stepped aside, giving us just enough space to walk by. But as I passed him, he grabbed my arm, just a quick grip, tight enough to make me stop in my tracks. "You know," he said, his voice low, "if you really wanted to go, you wouldn't have said that. You'd be gone already." It was like a switch flipped. I didn't think. I just yanked my arm away and pulled Emma with me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaky but firm. We didn't look back as we hurried down the trail, the light of their campfire flickering behind us, but I could feel them watching us. We didn't say anything to each other until we were safely back at our tent. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the darkness outside, not knowing if they were still out there. I still don't know what exactly happened, but I know that they didn't want us to leave. There was something about that whole interaction that felt wrong, like they were pushing us to stay for some reason. I haven't camped since then, and I don't know if I ever will again. I don't think I could handle it. Every time I close my eyes, I remember the way they looked at us, those smiles that never reached their eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just trying to be friendly. They were trying to keep us there, and for what? I don't think I'll ever know. I still can't believe it happened. It feels like a nightmare that I somehow managed to wake up from, but it wasn't a dream. It was real. The storm that night was one of the worst I've seen in years. The rain wasn't just falling, it was pouring, coming down in sheets, battering everything it touched. The wind was howling, rattling the windows, making the house creak and groan. It felt like the world outside had been swallowed by the storm. It was around 10 p.m. when I realized I had a problem. I'd noticed a small leak in the roof the day before, but with everything going on, I kept putting it off. That night, after a few hours of rain, I saw a small puddle forming on the kitchen floor under the window. It wasn't much, but I knew if I didn't take care of it, it would get worse. I couldn't afford to have more water damage, so I decided to climb up into the attic and patch the leak myself. I grabbed my ladder from the garage and set it up outside the back door, directly under the small overhang of the roof. I knew it wasn't ideal. The rain was making the ground slippery, but I figured it wouldn't take long. Just enough time to fix the leak and get back inside before the storm got any worse. The ladder creaked a little when I climbed up, but it held steady. I could barely hear the wind over the pounding rain, but I focused on the task at hand. I remember thinking how strange it was that I was the only one out in the storm. The street was quiet, no lights on anywhere else in the neighborhood. Just the rain, the wind, and the occasional flash of lightning. I had just started to loosen the shingles when the first thing went wrong. My foot slipped. I didn't even have time to react. I felt my whole body pitch sideways, and before I knew it, I was hitting the ground. My back slammed hard into the wet grass, knocking the wind out of me, and I let out a gasp, trying to push myself up. The impact left me dazed, and I could barely catch my breath. I lay there for a second, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I heard something that made my heart stop. A footstep. It was faint, just a soft sound, but it was definitely there. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm. Someone was outside. My heart raced, and I slowly lifted my head, looking around in the dark. The rain was so heavy, I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky. I was too disoriented to think clearly, but the feeling of someone being out there, watching, gripped me hard. I couldn't make out anything through the rain, but the sound of the footsteps wasn't getting any further away. I held my breath, hoping I was imagining it, but then I heard a low voice. "Hello," the voice called. I froze. It wasn't loud, just quiet enough to be unsettling. It sounded like a man, but I couldn't tell if he was close or far away. My body tensed. The last thing I wanted to do was confront whoever was out there, but I also didn't want to stay outside alone, exposed, while there was someone lurking around my property in the middle of a storm. "Is someone out there?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was no answer for a moment. The wind howled again, and the rain pounded the ground so loudly it almost drowned out my own voice. But then, I heard it again. The voice, a little closer this time. "Yeah, I'm just trying to find some shelter. You all right?" I didn't know what to make of it. I should have been scared, but there was something in the tone that didn't quite sit right. It wasn't the voice of someone lost or seeking help, it sounded almost casual. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just had a little accident." My ladder slipped. There was another pause, and then the voice spoke again, this time sounding almost too calm. "Can I help you?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I should have gone inside, locked the door, and called for help. But I was standing in the rain, wet and aching, and I felt an irrational need to make sure this person wasn't just going to walk away. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound more assertive. A few seconds passed before the voice replied, and it was so close now that I could feel my pulse quicken. "Just someone looking for a little shelter," the voice said, and this time it sounded almost like a smirk in his tone. I turned around quickly, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, but the rain was blurring everything. The more I tried to focus, the harder it became to see anything clearly. I was standing there, exposed, my back to the house, and I had no idea where this person was. I need to go inside, I said, my voice wavering. It's dangerous out here. I backed toward the owl slowly, not turning my back on the sound of the voice. You sure you're all right? The man asked, stepping closer now, just on the edge of my hearing. I could come help you up. You don't look so good. I felt something shift inside of me. This wasn't just a stranger asking if I needed help. This was something else. His tone, his words, they felt wrong, like he was toying with me, testing how far he could push. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the key. My heart was pounding now, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. Before I could turn the key in the lock, the man spoke again, this time louder, his voice just a few feet away. Let me help you in, he said, his voice too soft, too knowing. The door finally opened, and I didn't hesitate. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it as quickly as I could. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. The rain still hammered against the windows, the wind howling outside. I didn't dare look outside again. My head was spinning, but the one thought that kept repeating in my mind was that he had been so close, too close. I still don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I know one thing for sure, something was off. And I was never going to forget the feeling of being watched in the middle of that storm. I had been living in my house for a couple of years when I decided it was time for a change. The kitchen was outdated, and the bathroom needed work. I'd heard about a contractor from a friend who had done some remodeling in her home and recommended him. He seemed professional when we met, and his references checked out. I felt comfortable hiring him to do the job. I work long hours, so I figured it would be easier for him to come by during the day while I was at work. He was going to handle everything, the demo, the construction, and all the finishing touches. I trusted him to do a good job, but I didn't think much of it when I left for work every day. I was busy, and I had other things on my mind. The first few days went smoothly. He showed up early, worked long hours, and left when I got home. The house looked like a mess with all the construction, but I figured that was just part of the process. After a week or so, the kitchen cabinets were out, the counters were being replaced, and the walls had been stripped down. It was messy, but it was clear he was making progress. But then things started to feel off. I had a feeling that something wasn't right when I came home one evening and found my bedroom door slightly open. I had never left it open, and it wasn't like I had forgotten. I'm not someone who leaves doors open unless I'm in and out of a room. The rest of the house was just as I had left it, so I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, I came home and found the same thing. My bedroom door was ajar, and I could have sworn I had closed it. I started to feel uneasy but told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was forgetful. Maybe the door didn't latch properly, or maybe I had left it open without thinking. I tried to dismiss it, but it kept happening. Every day, I'd come home to find my bedroom door open, and sometimes other rooms felt slightly different. The couch cushions were arranged differently, or a picture frame that I hadn't touched was crooked. Little things that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if something strange was really going on. But every time I walked into the house, I felt a chill in the air, like someone else had been there. Then one evening, I had an idea. I'd started working from home occasionally, so I decided to stay in the house and keep an eye on things. I made sure to close my bedroom door before I left for work. I wanted to see if anything changed while I was gone. That evening, when I came home, I opened the door slowly, and my stomach dropped. It was open. Wide open. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. I had clearly locked it before leaving, and now it was wide open, just like the other times. I went inside, checking for anything else that was out of place. That's when I noticed the camera. It was small, hidden on the corner of the room, nearly impossible to see unless you were specifically looking for it. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. My first thought was to call the police, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. But I knew I had to get confirmation before doing anything drastic. The next morning, I made sure to leave the camera exactly where it was. I left for work as usual, but this time I went to the local store and bought a few things. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do, but I had to know. I wanted to see if there were more cameras in the house. I came back that evening, pretending everything was normal. I went straight to my bedroom and checked the camera again. Sure enough, it had been moved. The angle was slightly different, as though someone had been adjusting it while I was gone. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was being watched. I was sure of it now. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust. I knew I couldn't confront him just yet. What if he denied it? What if it escalated? I had to be careful. But I had no idea how deep this had gone or how long it had been going on. I knew he'd been in my house when I wasn't there, but I couldn't figure out how long this had been happening. The next day, I took the camera to a friend who worked in tech. I told her what had been happening and showed her the footage. It was unmistakable. He had been recording me. He had been watching my every move when I was at home, when I was alone. My worst fears were coming true. He had been in my personal space, invading my privacy for God knows how long. I called the police that night. I told them everything. They came to the house, and we looked through the footage together. There were hours of recordings, me walking around the house, sitting on the couch, making dinner, even moments when I was changing clothes. I felt disgusted, violated, like everything I had was no longer mine. The worst part was not knowing how long he'd been doing this. How many times had he watched me when I was completely unaware? The police didn't waste any time. They went to his office, and they found more cameras, more hidden equipment. Apparently, he had been doing this to other clients as well. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I had been living in a nightmare. Someone I had trusted to do work in my house had turned out to be someone I should have never let through my door. I never saw him again after that day. I don't know what happened to him, but I know he was arrested and charged with multiple offenses. It's been months now, and I still don't feel safe in my own house. I've had all the locks changed and the security system upgraded. But no matter what I do, I can't stop feeling like I'm being watched. Like I'm never really alone. I've been trying to move on, but some days it's harder than others. I still check my bedroom door, even though I know it's locked. And sometimes, I wonder how many people out there are doing the same thing he did to me, hiding in plain sight. It happened on a Friday evening. I had just put my son to bed, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I had ordered some things online earlier that week. Maybe it was a late delivery. I got up and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a brown jacket holding a small box. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but he smiled when I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. Delivery 4. He glanced at a piece of paper in his hand. Mrs. Taylor? The name was wrong, but I figured maybe it was a mix-up with the delivery company. I think you've got the wrong house, I said. He chuckled nervously. Sorry about that. Could you just confirm the address? That's when I started to feel uneasy. The box didn't have a label on it, and he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. I asked him which delivery service he was with, but he avoided the question, mumbling something about working with a third-party company. I don't think that's for me, I said, starting to close the door. His hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door before I could shut it. Wait, he said, his tone changing. I think this might actually be for you. I froze. His smile was gone, and his grip on the door was firm. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Let go of the door, I said, trying to sound confident. Instead of listening, he pushed against the door, hard enough to rattle the chain. I leaned my weight against it, but I could feel him testing it, trying to force it open. I just need to come in for a second, he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm, and it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. I'm calling the police, I said, backing away from the door and grabbing my phone off the table. He stopped pushing and looked straight through the gap. You won't, he said, his voice low and even. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I dialed 911 anyway, but before I could hit call, he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain held, but it groaned under the pressure. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran to grab the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the living room. Stop it! I yelled, holding the bat in front of me like a shield. He didn't respond. The chain snapped with a loud crack, and the door flew open. He stepped inside, shutting it behind him, and for a second, we just stared at each other. He wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked determined. I don't want to hurt you, he said, raising his hands like he was trying to calm me down. Just stay quiet, and this will be over soon. Get out of my house. I screamed, raising the bat. He lunged at me before I could swing it, grabbing my wrists and forcing the bat out of my hands. I struggled against him, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger than he looked. He shoved me against the wall, pinning me there. Where's the kid? He asked, his breath hot against my face. I froze. Leave him alone, I said, my voice shaking. His grip tightened, and he smiled with this slow, deliberate grin that made my skin crawl. That's up to you. I knew I couldn't let him near my son. I'd die before I let that happen. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I kneed him in the groin as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the bat from the floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung it with everything I had, hitting him square in the side. He yelped and fell to his knees, clutching his ribs. I didn't stop. I swung again, this time catching him on the shoulder. He cursed and tried to grab the bat, but I pulled it back and hit him once more, this time in the head. He collapsed onto the floor, groaning, but I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and bolted outside, screaming for help. A neighbor heard me and came running. I told him what happened, and he called the police while I stayed on the porch, shaking and trying not to cry. The man didn't come out of the house. By the time the cops arrived, he was unconscious on the floor, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. They took him away in handcuffs, and I later found out he wasn't a delivery driver at all. He'd been scoping out houses in the neighborhood for weeks, pretending to deliver packages as a cover. He had a record breaking and entering assault. That night, I slept in my son's room with the door locked and the bat by my side. I don't think I've ever felt so scared in my life, but I'm just grateful we made it out okay.